KnockBack, the retro and nostalgia podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to KnockBack. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined as always by my brother Dagan Moriarty of the Sackville Bagginses. Dagan, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Proud feet.
As he's smoking his weed. I love how everyone's getting all fucked up in that. It's good. Dude, the Hobbits want to party, man.
Oh, we're going to get into some pipe weed.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And some long bottom leaf.
After this, I'm definitely going to get into some pipe weed. You can count on that. Dig, how are you today? How's life?
Everything's good. I was just thinking of a funny thing. We delayed by a few minutes this morning, and it just put a funny thought in my head. I had a real dilemma this week, and I was wondering if you could relate to this. So your niece, my daughter, has dance 4 nights a week. She's an avid dancer. She goes about 6 hours a week over 4 nights, and then some weekends she travels for competition and stuff. So that's her thing. So 4 nights a week, I pick her up from dance anywhere between 7 and 9 o'clock, depending on the night. And our tradition is to go to Wawa for a snack. You know, maybe a after dinner, a drink, smoothie, milkshake, whatever. So that's our thing. So me and Lil go into Wawa, and you know, I'm typically not a big fan, but my family loves Wawa, just like everybody else like everybody else on the planet that knows Wawa. Right?
I basically indentured Dagan to Wawa when I moved there. Like I make him just constantly go.
Well, it's funny now that it trickled its way all the way down, and now you guys have it in Richmond. I mean, there's one a mile from. Yeah,
there's one right between Dana and my house and Dana's, and we're 2 minutes away from each other. So.
It's crazy. And for those of you who don't know, Wawa is a convenience store, chain of convenience stores in the Northeast, like a 7-Eleven or Piggly Wiggly or something, but it's a Northeast, especially in the Philadelphia area. It's an institution. I mean, it means a lot to people. Not a big fan.
But real quick, I just want to point out, it's not because people are confused. It's not just a convenience store. The reason Wawa is notable is because it is incredibly high quality, and they make like all sorts of food custom ordered all day and all night. So you can go in there and order breakfast at like 3 a.m. or 2 p.m. or,
great point.
You know, like get sandwiches custom made and all. So I just wanted to throw out, because I think some people are confused. It's not like, it is kind of like 7-Eleven, but it's like much better than 7-Eleven.
It's not fair to relegate it to a 7-Eleven or like a Turkey Hill or something. It's better than that. It is. And they pride themselves on their quality and their Dietz and Watson meats. Nope. Nope.
Boar's got to get in there and crack that nut.
Never going to happen. But no, Colin's right. And of course, there's a gas station, and the buildings are beautiful, and they pride themselves on providing, even through COVID, I think, providing restrooms for people. And, you know, it's big with the landscapers and the truck driver. You know what I mean? But it's not. But it is. It's a cut above your typical convenience store. Everybody loves it. I don't know anybody that doesn't like it except for me. And I usually don't like it, honestly, because of the parking lots. I don't like the way the parking lots are set up. If you like your car, Wawa's not just a good place to be. You know how I am. I'm very fastidious with the car. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked.
Yeah, please.
So we go in one night, and there's, you know, you guys could probably relate to this. There's this one person that works, and she's a little rude. Now, Wawa's customer service is great. The people are always, you know, they're always very high-spirited and friendly, and how you doing and everything like that. They pride themselves on their customer service. There's one girl in there that's rude, and I never had a run-in with her, but she's just been on my radar over the past year that she's been there or whatever. I just see her. I see the way she deals with people. She seems a little salty, a little disgruntled and stuff. Never had a run-in with her before. So she usually works behind the concessions making the food, but she was working the cash register on this night. So there was no way to avoid her. So
on this fateful night.
So we go up, we have the order, and, you know, you put your debit card through the little machine, especially with COVID. There's no like hand-to-hand interaction. And you know how you get prompted by the thing, you want debit, credit, whatever, you know, as you're paying. And there was some sort of prompt that wasn't going through with my card. And she decided she's just going to stand there. I got into a conversation with Lily about what was happening while my card was in there and everything. And she decided that she was just going to stand there and watch me notice the screen. She didn't say, sir, like you have to redo something or press the button or press yes in order for the prompt to continue or whatever. So I think she would have honestly stayed there for 40 minutes and not said anything to me. So Lilia realized it and was like, oh, Dad, you got to do that. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah. So now I'm pissed off in the back. I'm already having a bad week, right? I'm already a little bit kind of on edge. And now I'm acting like it's okay, but I'm mad that she didn't say anything, right? And by the time the transaction was over and I pulled my card out, I was already getting heated for whatever reason. It was late. I was tired, whatever. Work is crazy. And she doesn't ask me if I need a bag. And of course I need a bag. I got all this stuff. I got mac and cheese. I got smoothies, chips, drinks, and everything.
Yeah.
Like that.
Also, they just throw like one item in a bag at Wawa and just give it to you. So that's
now weird. Here's the not to get sidetracked, but the Wawas down the shore charge you if you need a bag.
Very California-like.
Very California-like, especially in Avalon and Stone Harbor and the hoity-toity places down there. In Bucks County in Pennsylvania, they don't do that yet. I'm sure it's not far off. So she doesn't ask me if I need a bag. So I'm like, can I have a bag, please? And she just, she does one of those things where she doesn't even look where the bags are. She's looking at me and she reaches her hand down and snaps a bag up and hands it to me. Not saying anything, doesn't say thank you, doesn't say anything. So it was one of those things where you kind of surprise yourself. I snatch it. I snatch the bag out of her hand. Nasty, right? I just snatch it like that, lightning quick. As I'm doing it, I'm like, oh shit, like you're setting off some harsh, some bad feelings right now. There's going to be some bad blood after this. It's like one of those things in the moment you're like, oh, you kind of shock yourself. And I walk away and Lily's like, what the hell are you doing? Like, she's like, what's wrong or whatever. And I'm like, we're whispering and I'm like, oh, she's a bitch. She's like, she didn't do anything. And I'm like, so is this whole thing. So now the next night comes around.
Oh, no.
And Lily and I are like, what are we going to do? She's in there all the time. She is never not in that place. So she's either going to be making your sandwich or your smoothie or she's going to be ringing you up. So I'm like, we're going to McDonald's. So next night after that, we go to McDonald's, grab a milkshake. I couldn't even deal with it, right? Night after that, I'm like, all right, I kind of steel myself. I'm like, we have to deal with this. We just have to do it, So I'm like, let's go in disguises. Now, not thinking like the whole thing with me and Lilia, we're an institution there. We're in there every night. And we're together. That's how we're noticed. So she's like, you can't wear your Republican mask. She refers to the scarf style mask as Republican masks, my daughter. Not a Republican, but that's a whole nother story.
Why does she call it that?
I have no idea. She's Lilia. I have no idea. So she's like, you can't wear the Republican mask. So
her mother's a Republican?
I get the mask, the traditional mask.
Yeah.
We're thinking of different things we could do. I'm like, get your hair out of the bun. Like, let's do a different thing. I said, walk with a limp. I don't know what just the things we're thinking. So we go in, and I feel she's behind the sandwich counter on this night, on this faithful night. I'm like, Lil, we have to go in. This is an important night because we have to feel it out. We have to see if this is really on her radar, if there's really any bad feelings. Maybe she never even paid attention to it. Who knows, right? I go in, I feel the eye darts immediately from behind the sandwich counter now. She's telling a story to one of her friends about how she hates some current top 40 performer girl. I don't know who, Ariana Grande. I don't know, somebody who, and she's getting real salty and she's getting like real vocal about it. Like, oh, she's a bitch and she's using curse words and stuff. And I'm like, no, she's a number, man. She's like, this is going to be a bad scene because she's not the typical Wawa employee. She seems like she's a little above it. Like she doesn't care about cursing in front of the customers and customer service and all that kind of stuff. So, and I saw her looking. I have to look at her. I have to eventually sort of steel myself to look her way and see if she was staring right at me. So this is the tension I've been dealing with nightly. And you can only go to McDonald's so many times. Wawa is going to be, we can't not go to Wawa. But have you ever had an instance like this where
definitely,
you have a stranger essentially, but it's somebody who's actually motivating the trajectory of your day just through some little conflict?
Yeah, pretty much all the time. I mean,
really, this happens a lot. Because I'm wondering, especially during COVID, we're not going out a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I should be clear that I go through my life to have personal interactions with people as little as possible. So. Like anything I can do. That's what's one of the wonderful things about having Dustin as executive producer is I'm just like, I don't have to talk to anyone anymore. Now you just do it.
You do it.
Yeah. Like he deals with all the vendors and he deals with all the problems. I'm like, you just do it. I don't want to talk to anyone. So it's funny because I had an interesting, it's a brief story, but a few weeks ago, on this show, I was telling you how I got a no solicitor sign on my door. Okay. So this morning, Micah and I are, so it's Saturday we're recording this. Yes. Micah and I are laying in bed. It's like 10 o'clock in the morning and we're just talking. And I hear like a at the door. Now, my pool's being constructed and we're actually having an issue this week because they started to excavate it and then the excavator broke down, like literally 5 or 10 minutes in.
I noticed that off-brand excavator, but let's save that story for another time. Well, and your photos.
So yeah, it's like some sort of like, Chinese knockoff. But the thing is that the pool company I'm using, they can't use their own excavator because my backyard is too small. So they need to like rent an excavator, right? So they rented this excavator, it broke down. It stayed in my backyard for like an entire day. It was just like a pile of dirt and like 2 gashes out of my, it looks like it was like an archaeological dig right in my backyard. And then the electrician came over the next day and started doing his work or whatever. And I kind of feel bad actually, because just as an aside, I'm kind of like getting a little strifey with the pool people, like where it's like, I'm like, we lost a whole week because the excavator broke down, like we lost a whole week because of this, so, but we had like, cause I sent like a really terse text message to the dude yesterday and then he called me and I was like, oh no. So then we had to have a conversation and like, I felt bad afterward. Everyone always makes me feel bad, even though I feel like not very many things are my fault. But anyway, he's a nice guy. I want to get the pool. That's not even the point of the story. So I woke up this morning and so, that's why I told you, because it was a rat, tat. And I know that they're going to, at some point in the next few days, like drop off the new excavator, right? Okay. So I was like, oh, maybe it's the dudes. And so I looked at my camera on my phone, Scarface-like, and I noticed someone standing out there. So then he rings the doorbell and I'm like, all right. So I like go downstairs and I'm like, hey, what's up? And I don't know if this happens in your neighborhood, but it happens in mine.
Okay.
I don't know if it's because of a new neighborhood and like people are kind of getting settled in with like all their different products, but people come around like lawn care people, pest control people, etc. And they try to pitch you deals for whatever, but they also try to pitch you deals by getting your neighbors involved, right?
Yes.
Like if we get, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So the dude knocked on my door, rang my doorbell. I thought he was from the pool company. I'm like, hey, what's up? And he's like, he has his tablet in his hand. So I immediately like right away, I'm like, oh my God, so yep. So I'm like, he's like, this is what he said to me. He's like, hello, did your neighbors tell you that I was going to come by at some point? And I'm like,
son of a bitch.
And I literally said, I have my head poked out the door and the no solicitations thing is on the door. And I'm like, no solicitations. And I just stared at him and he was like, oh, okay. And then I just shut the door and locked it or whatever. Now, I was lamenting to Micah. I'm like, I am getting tired now of people putting me in positions that I am overtly trying to avoid.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And I'm actually starting to resent it in some way. Micah always says that I have like a very Larry David-like life because because she knows me really well now and is around me all the time. And she's like, you really do try to go out of your way to be nice and friendly to people, to be very communicative, timely, whatever the case might be, right? Like I really do. I want to stay out of your way. If I say I'm going to do something, I do it. If I say I'm going to do something on a day or a time, it's going to get done, et cetera, and so on. And so I do these little things. It was part of the reason I had a conflict with the pool guy was because I was like, I just want you, I don't care if the pool gets built next year. I mean, I care, but can you just tell me what's going on? Or am I supposed, I told him, I was like, should I use my telepathy?
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Because like, and I actually like the guy that is building the pool. So I'm not trying to have like conflict or strife with him at all. In fact, I told him at the end of the conversation, I'm like, I'm sorry, I actually really like you. I just don't know why you won't talk to me.
Right, right.
So with the solicitation thing, I'm like, I literally put the sign up and then 2 weeks later, and I really wanted to say to the guy, I wanted to be like, who do you think you are? I mean, no offense. I know you're working. It's Saturday. You probably don't want to do this. It's probably like the low man on the totem pole shit. I get it. Right. But my door says no solicitations and you don't give a fuck.
Dude.
Why? And then I'm the one who has to look like a dickhead by saying no solicitations, dude. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Stop putting me. I am not putting out I was telling, in the conversation with Micah, I'm like, I'm going nuts because it either is me or it is the world, that is broken because maybe it's me, because I was like, I don't know how this can keep happening over and over again. I am not like doing anything except for trying to get things done and for people to leave me alone.
It's so funny, dude. I'm sorry. It almost seems like being upfront and by doing your due diligence, you're actually courting disaster. The other thing is, why are they going door to door? I wonder in a normal world, let's date back to 2018, 2019. Going door to door, really, in the modern age, it's as bad as telemarketing. You're basically courting business through awkwardness, through making people say yes just to make you go away. I mean, that's what it is. That's what telemarketing is too. You don't do business that way because it's completely unlooked for. Let's say this guy was selling a fertilizer, like a monthly lawn treatment or something. If you wanted that, there's 9 other ways for you to get it, especially in the modern digital age, right? With our smartphones and tablets and computers and stuff. Do you really need to go door to door? You're going to get business because the sheer awkwardness of having a conversation with a stranger and people just not knowing how to say no and, making you want to go away, a combination of those things. That's what the business, it's a really insidious business when you think about it. It's the same as telemarketing. It's getting in somebody's face when they don't want to be even having that interaction, especially during COVID. It's nuts. You know what I mean? That's what pisses me off about the whole thing, because they are doing their job. But listen, there's 900,000 jobs for you to choose. If you stop choosing those jobs, then that business will stop. You know what I mean?
And I also just feel, especially in this market where I think people are really gonna have their choice of a job, even on the low end, which is good, but because things are about to boom. But it's just like, get the fuck off my property. Why are you here?
You have to.
I don't understand. Like, what else am I supposed to do?
I don't know what else today.
It was 10, a little after 10 in the morning on a Saturday.
It's early.
It's like, don't. Because now I'm really just starting to be like, you know what, man? I think this is not me. I think it is the world. I don't know what else I can possibly do to just, I'd really try to be friendly. And like I said, communicative, patient, kind. And I just don't know what else to do with people,
I love this. First of all, tip of the cap to this particular guy that came up to your door for the whole, did so-and-so tell you neighbors mentioned I was in the neighborhood? That was his
first line. I'm like, what are you, Tom Cruise? I have no idea who the fuck you even are.
The only other way he could have taken that to the next level is named a neighbor by name with like a generic name. Like, did Joe tell you I was coming? I was going to swing by.
And it's also like, what do you think? We have like a council around here? No one talks to each other. It's like, we know each other, but it's not like, what are we sitting around a table? Like,
dude.
My neighbors are letting me know, hey, the guy from Evergreen is going to come over in a couple of days, and I look for that knock. So you can get 5% off your lawn treatment.
I would say.
I think I would say
this
Google
guy was a genius, except for he doesn't know what solicitation means. Otherwise,
I don't think he does. I don't think he does, because when I said it to him, he's like, oh, I'm like, I think you need to get a dictionary, my dude.
Good.
You can go sell those door to door like it's 1950.
Oh, dude, I'm sorry that happened. That
was more encyclopedias, but yeah, it's okay. No, it's funny. I mean, it's just never ends. My life just, no matter what I try to do to make my life easier, it just becomes harder and harder.
You got to see them. You got to see them coming down. You see them coming down the block with that, the telltale, as you said, iPad in their hands now, and usually like a polo shirt, maybe with if they're official, with the logo on the chest or whatever.
Right.
And just see how much you have to shutter your house up. It's a 90-degree day. You close all the windows, draw all the blinds. Like, it looks like a house in the wintertime somewhere in the, up in Canada or something. And see if they still come to the door. You kind of gauge their audacity.
Yeah. Well, because I actually was starting to think, I mean, you haven't seen my house yet, I don't think, but if you walk up, there's you walk to the door, you have to walk to the door. Like, you walk upstairs and then you walk to the door. So
yeah, you have the little
there's all this space and little columns and stuff of wood. Yeah. And I'm thinking I'm just going to get one of those things and just put it up, so you can't even go access the door. And then the package guys can just shove the packages under the rope, it's like I'm at Disneyland and the ride's closed.
You could do that. You could do the moat. You could do
I thought a no solicitation sign. I mean, it's not one of those cheap ones either. It's a pretty nice one.
Right.
It's not like a sticker. It's like I got the 3M double-sided stuff, the Velcro, and I put it on. I use the level. It's all nice and even. And
they sell them where you buy the for sale signs and stuff, right? That you pop in your car window or whatever.
Right. I bought it on Amazon. I just literally looked for no solicitation signs and then looked for a nice one. And that was it. The guy across the street from me has a no solicitation sign that's a metal one that is really nice, and it says no, he doesn't want any of it.
Right.
Yeah. So like, just
listen,
he's a
I
nice guy.
sprang for like an extra $20 for this sign type. That's it.
That was what was so annoying the most. It's like, I don't know.
I like your story better than mine. I could really relate. Although I
wonder what would happen. I wonder what would happen if I just went out in the world and swung my elbows all around. Like, what would happen? Like, it can't possibly be any worse than me being nice to everyone, right? Because that's not working.
That's not working.
So
you might have to change your track.
I'll tell you right now, it's not working. Yeah. All right. Dig, let's get into the topic.
All right, my friend, let's do it.
This is a fan voted topic. It's Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring, the movie from 2001, extended edition, so almost 4 hours long, but that's the way it's got to be. Mm-hmm. And this is a great film. I actually don't know that I've seen it since maybe around the time, like maybe college. Like I think I saw it in the theater, and we'll talk about that because we were together. But also, I think I saw it on DVD. Dad is really into it at that time, but I don't know. It's probably been 15 years or more since I've actually seen Fellowship. And I don't think I've read Fellowship since even before the films came out, although I would have to check the mind bank a little more carefully for that. But so this was a cool time for me to sit down and really enjoy it. And I'm wondering just at the top, like, what did you think about doing this topic? I mean, this is such an important film, an important product, seminal product. We did a topic of KnockBack some time ago about Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, which the books, and we just talked about it generally. I think we'll go back and do those again at some point too, but this is only about the film.
Yes.
I feel like it's a big topic, by the way, and I'm really much more interested in the themes in the movie than anything else. And so I want to talk about those, but there's plenty we can talk about. So overarching, I mean, what are your thoughts on the film, about covering the film on our show, what it means to you, and all the rest?
One of my favorite franchises. It was nice to go back. I'm really glad you guys voted for this one because it's nice to go back. You know, we talk about it sometimes on the pod, like, you know, we did those topics where we lumped a lot of things in. Indiana Jones trilogy, Karate Kid, Back to the Future, stuff like that. Where
we made mistakes early on. You know.
Yeah, exactly.
We were learning.
You know, I was thinking about this too, like, I think also we were wrong-headed in approaching it that way. We learned from our mistakes, but also you go online and you see people cover a topic. They'll talk about Lord of the Rings on a YouTube show or something. Famous people with millions of subscribers. And they'll do this topic, Fellowship, the movie extended edition. They'll talk about it for 20 minutes. So I think also we were kind of steered wrong by that, just by the culture of people not really spending the time on the stuff. But it was nice to go in and say, okay, we're going to revisit them, even though initially we were talking about the trilogy of books, really. We got into a little bit of everything, a smattering of everything. But also it's nice to go back in and just talk about the stories on a much more granular level now, starting with Definitely. Fellowship. And really one of the most important, we call it a franchise now, but this was like, you know, you got to remember these books, these Tolkien books were pre-franchise. I mean, this is one of the most important, I would say, arguably, and influential pieces of fiction from the last 100 years. And I think back to my introduction with mom and dad. You know, they're the ones who introduced me to these books. I was really thinking about this. I have, you know, you have those random memories. I must have been 6, 7, 8 years old. I couldn't have been any older than that. It was like a Saturday or Sunday morning, crawling into the middle of bed. You know, mom and dad are waking up. I get in the middle of them and we're talking and they're telling me, I don't know if one of the books was on the nightstand, whether it was The Hobbit or one of the trilogy. And I remember them telling me about a bunch of books I needed to read. So maybe think about, I'm getting a little older, maybe 8. And they're telling me specifically about these books called The Lord of the Rings. And they were also talking about Watership Down. Like, you have to read these books. These are the must-read books for you. And I'm thinking, Lord of the Rings, that sounds really weird. So my experience with Lord of the Rings dates all the way back to then. And I don't think I think I read The Hobbit in high school, but I didn't even read the trilogy until college. That's when I really started to ingest and devour those books and read them over and over again and stuff like that. And then, of course, the movies, not too much in the late 90s, early aughts. You know, we had the rumors of these movies coming out. And I was really curious to see how well it would hold up. And it holds up great. You know, from
it does.
20 years ago, I think it holds up really, really well. I have very few problems with it. Even the special effects are dated, but I think we're so spoiled now with the rapid evolution of what they're capable of technologically and artistically and stuff. So that's par for the course. So that was fun to re-explore that and just seeing, like, you know what's so striking to me, man? We'll get into this with the acting. it's so crazy to corral and sort of marshal a project like this. Yes, very big budget, big movie studio behind it, visionary directors and behind the camera people, all of that. But to have everybody on board for treating this project so seriously, you know, you think back, it almost makes me lament, like, and this is a weird thought that I never thought of. We didn't really have a 1950s/1960s version of Lord of the Rings. How interesting would it have been for a big Hollywood studio? You think back to like the big Hollywood studios, magnates, tycoons, big budget, marquee actors making a lot of money, even in the 50s and 60s. A studio could have easily optioned this and done this. And then you would have had a really campy version. Think back to sci-fi of that era, 50s and even 60s, how campy that would have been. We never really got, now we had Tarzan and King Arthur and things like the Three Musketeers and other things that were like a little bit more fantasy-esque, but a proper sword and sorcery fantasy. We never really got like a 1950s B-movie version where it would have been like marquee actors, but really campy performances and almost treating things like a fairy tale or like a kid's story. That was the mentality back then. And you know, for Peter Jackson and all of his people to put something together and all the actors and actresses being on board for treating this like a proper drama, not just a kid's story. And you could argue that probably started largely with Star Wars in 77, where it was like you took sci-fi out of camp and you made it more grounded. You made it more serious. You made it more adult. You made it more emotional. Now it's like a story not just centered on spaceships and bad guys like Flash Gordon, but you know, a farm boy that longs to get away from his life and longs for something greater and, you know, really grounding it with emotion and relatability. And that's what it's funny that it took till 2000 and 2001, 2002 to really have these fantasy stories like sci-fi was doing maybe 30 years earlier. So that was like my thing on this. That was really a track for me in watching this, paying attention to like, even not only the Ian McKellens, but even the Orlando Blooms, like, they were really embodying their characters. They were really treating this seriously. And I think this was really where fantasy started to go in that direction. You know, with the Gen Xers and a sensitivity towards the content and the evolution of nerd culture and coming out of a camp and a more of acceptability, you know. And I was really paying attention to how striking and how successful this is because, you know, Ralph Bakshi tried it in animation in the 70s. Rankin and Bass tried it with their animated films in the late 70s and early 80s with their made-for-TV movies and stuff. And they were good. There was good aspects of those things. And this is a proper evolution of that. But isn't it crazy how it took so long to get this into a live-action film version? It's nuts.
Yeah, it's interesting to read about a little bit, the production of it. We'll talk a little bit about that because it is fascinating. I think that you have to have big mind. You really touched on it perfectly. You have to have big-minded people, ambitious people that are willing to bite off a huge, basically 12-hour movie.
Yeah.
And film it, produce it, corral it, and all of that into something and marshal it into something worthwhile. And I think it can't be, because you were saying, I mean, this might be, I don't know that I'm overstating it. I mean, you were saying that the book came out in 1954, Fellowship, and I would argue that the trilogy and The Hobbit are amongst the most important fiction ever. And the reason I say that is simply because, and including the classics and great novelists and all of that, I really think it's up there because of how important everything it brought to the table was thematically in terms of reviving some fantasy tropes that might have been dormant or non-existent in previous fiction, and how this story is. So again, I want to repeat that this story is the source of virtually all role-playing game tropes, along with and fantasy tropes and D&D tropes, along with Dungeons and Dragons, bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah. And
I don't think that can be really lost on me. I mean, just the idea of elves, orcs, dwarves, all these kinds of things. These aren't things that Tolkien made up, but it's his interpretation of them that we stick with today.
Yeah.
The greedy mining dwarves, the slick, beautiful, ethereal elves, and the really untrustworthy, dastardly humans, and this is fantasy. I mean, these are the tropes of fantasy and high fantasy. And so it can't be understated, because we talk a lot about George Martin and Game of Thrones, which you and I both love as well. And I would argue that the Game of Thrones TV show are better than these movies. And we can talk about that later, because they are apples to apples comparisons, I think. But there would be also no Game of Thrones without Tolkien. There's no way.
No, dude.
So I really feel like the butterfly effect, just the beating wing of the 1954 novel of Fellowship, and really Hobbit, which came before that, but this flapping wing, and all the people that turned Tolkien down and didn't understand what he was doing, which are most people that he encountered.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them. I mean, why? You have to have a vision. I mean, this is what we were talking about with Peter Jackson and everyone. You have to have a vision. I mean, from the very beginning, Tolkien had to have a vision. His publisher and editor had to have a vision. And the audience had to have a vision and a passion. And it's funny you brought up Mom and Dad, because I also remember, especially Dad, being really into these books. He was the one that got me to read them when I was in high school. I read The Hobbit first and then the trilogy after that. I like The Hobbit better than the trilogy, personally. I think it's fucking awesome.
Oh, it's brilliant.
And one of the characters from The Hobbit that I love is supposed to be in Fellowship, and he's not. And we'll talk about him a little bit, but because we have a lot of letters about that, which I was surprised Tom Bombadil,
cool.
of course.
Oh.
But I always connect them with Dad as well. And I think we've said in the past, maybe when we did the previous episode years ago in California, but I remember, our parents had a really beautiful master bedroom, and you would walk in, and then in the corner would be like a dressing room and then their bathroom and everything. And I remember that Dad had like just a small piece of a piece of furniture in the corner of the dressing room that had just the trilogy on it. I don't know if you remember this. It was just a box set of the trilogy, and they were like different colors. They were paperback. They were beat up. And that was like my first, I remember pulling them out and kind of comparing them, because you were reading at that time like Dragonlance and shit like that, I think, and other things. Yeah. So kind of trying to understand like what is the difference here, and like what is this these sets of features that these books bring with them. And as far as Dad is concerned, this particular movie, if I remember correctly, and I think I do, we saw Christmas Day 2001 with Dad, Allie. It was me, you, Dad, and Allie, I think. Maybe that might have been it. Maybe Derek and Dana or something like that.
I think that's right.
And I remember seeing it very clearly. And it's as we said, because I remember laughing out loud at the my arc scene and my bow. Like you remember it, like everyone's saying it. It's like I always bring up the welcome to Earth thing from Independence Day. Will Smith doesn't say that. He doesn't say that. If you go back and listen, he says like welcome to Earth, and he punched, but everyone's like welcome to Earth. So with this in my mind, I was like thinking about like how much more dramatic, like in my mind, in my mind, like when they are going through and it's like Gimli and Legolas, Orlando Bloom playing Legolas is awesome. And he sounds like an effeminate gay man in my mind when he's like, and my bow, but it doesn't really sound like that, So I remember laughing at that, and Dad staring at us.
Oh yeah.
Getting mad at us because it was not appropriate, of course, but it really came out of nowhere. And what's so funny is that it's very similar to when I saw Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire one, in the theater, and Bonesaw, and which I think I might have saw with you as well, and thinking that was funny as hell. And then that ended up being something that everyone thought was funny. It's the same thing with My Axe, which everyone says. And it was just one of those things, like in the moment I understood before anyone knew that was funny, that was funny.
Awesome.
So
I love
so those are my memories of that.
I love
those are my memories,
man. Those are awesome.
So that was almost 20 years ago from the time we're recording this. Time has passed, but it's nuts, dude. So I want to get into this. I'm looking at my notes here, like what people wrote in, and there's so much to tackle.
There is. But
I'm wondering if we might just start with Frodo himself. And we'll begin here with Ernie M, who wrote in and said, hello, Moriarty Bros. How are we feeling about Elijah Wood's Frodo Baggins? I personally find him very unlikable, especially in Fellowship. He's just a bumbling idiot who wouldn't have gotten anywhere without Sam.
Wow.
So I'm interested in this because I think the roles top to bottom were cast so wonderfully that if you feel that way about Frodo's character, that's one thing, but thus Elijah Wood must be doing the character justice, because I like his rendition of. I remember being a little disappointed in seeing people's faces and having kind of visions ruined of the books because of the movies. And we could talk about that in a little while, but at the end of the day, it kind of works for me. So I'm wondering what you think about, Frodo and maybe even his Hobbit companions, Sean Astin and everyone else that's on board.
You have a famous book, trilogy of books that everybody knows over decades. The casting is so important. It was really interesting for me to hear. I never knew this before, that Peter Jackson had never seen any of Elijah Wood's work going into casting this. And he started out as a child actor. So he already had a little bit of filmography. He was definitely not an unknown commodity. And I think one of Jackson's casting people put Elijah Wood on his radar. And then, he came in and he read, and Elijah Wood's, really kind of tried to embrace the role and came in dressed up for the part and everything like that and really wanted it. But I love, almost every bit of casting in this is really, so acutely successful that it's almost hard to believe. You gotta give a shout out to all the casting people involved in movies who, normally you get a lot of this talk of praise centered around the director, but a lot of this is the casting people, and they really work behind the scenes. So it's important to say that. But Elijah Wood, man, I really love him in this part. I find him really nuanced. I think he's a great actor to begin with, which is really important. We'll say that about a lot of these actors and actresses, I think. But he brings not only the look of what you think a hobbit should embody physically, which is a tricky thing, man. This is unto only this work of fiction. It's not a dwarf. It's not an elf. It's something, unto only these 4 books, and something hard to sort of embody visually. This is a bold thing to even try to undertake this mission. I think he's really got the look down. And I think he's a character that outwardly I am already very sympathetic towards, because he's thrust into this situation unwanted. And if you know The Hobbit, which I think is important to start with The Hobbit, not the films, but with the book, to set the trajectory for how the trilogy is going to set off, I think it's important to read The Hobbit first. And you know that Frodo is really shades of his uncle Bilbo, in that he's a homebody. He loves where he's at. He's at peace with himself. He's at peace with who he is, where he lives, his life. And much like Bilbo was before he was thrust into this crazy adventure by Gandalf in The Hobbit, and now we know when we meet Bilbo in this book, he's a different person. He's got a restlessness, he's got a burden, he's got this itch to not be in the Shire anymore. He's seen the world, he's more worldly, he wants to go on an adventure, he feels restless. But Frodo is like Bilbo used to be. He's not looking for this adventure. He's not looking for this burden to undergo this enormous task that is seemingly a lot bigger than he is. So I'm already very sympathetic towards Frodo, because he basically undertakes this mission out of love for his friends, for Gandalf, not to be overly sensitive about it, but for Gandalf and especially for his uncle Bilbo. That's why he undertakes this mission. It's not for himself. And his enormous, you were talking about themes in this, and I think one of the important ones, Kyle, is, which with a lot of characters, not just Frodo, certainly the other hobbits that we get to know, but also some of the other characters, is that the person that you are underneath, the heart that beats underneath your exterior, who you really are underneath, who Sam really is underneath the village gardener, what he's all about, what makes him tick, his fabric. And I think that has a lot to do with Frodo too. Like, here's this homebody in the Shire enjoying the comforts of life, eating and smoking his pipe weed and all that kind of stuff. And, exploring that there's a heart and a courage underneath that, and a love for his friends, that he'll undertake the most enormous, daunting task just to, save the world and appease his friends and go along with things despite not wanting to, despite his great lament, his fear. I wish this never happened. That whole thing of, like, again, grounding these stories with emotion and, human emotion, making it relatable to us and the real world, in actual Earth, not Middle Earth. And I love that it's important. It's an important bit of casting. It's an important character. Everything centers around Frodo. And I just, for me, I really, you get into the bromance elements with him and Sam later on, which I'm sure we'll talk about with the Sam character. But I really think Elijah Wood is so good in this that I think it's going to be hard forevermore. He's a great actor. I think he's always going to be sort of saddled with the stigma, quote unquote, of this role. He's always going to be Frodo Baggins. I mean, that's how much now we think of him related to this part. It's amazing to me. I'm so surprised to hear people find him unlikable. What do you think of him?
I like him a lot. I mean, I was fascinated by the rendition one of the themes that I was kind of playing around with was just this unbridled bravery that I actually think everyone ends up showing. It's a little more resistant in the book because they have more time, but everyone kind of jumps in. And one of the things I wrote down in my notes that I wanted to touch on was that everyone has such an affinity ultimately for Gandalf that they'll do anything. I mean, like you said, we find Frodo celebrating his birthday. He's being, Bilbo celebrating his birthday. He's being manipulated by the ring, kept young. And Gandalf knows that. And I love the introduction to the Hobbits, like what they are. They have their own, it's almost like a libertarian paradise. So I was thinking about it. Like one of them says, like, we don't want to know what's going on the outside. Well said. People, like they want to just party. They're down to drink and eat and smoke, and they tend to their individual gardens and whatever the case might be. And it's a very pastoral, really interesting world that they come from. And yet I love that Frodo has this attachment to his uncle Bilbo and the adventures that he went on, that he knows that there's so much more outside of the Shire in Middle Earth, and he kind of jumps at the opportunity. It's interesting. My interpretation of it is a little different than the book because of the truncated nature of the film. We have a Frodo that kind of combines his want for adventure with the danger that's inherent in the ring and Gandalf's fear of it. And he sees that early on. Gandalf doesn't want the ring. And that's one thing I actually have to write this down because I want to talk about that too. I love, love, love the way the film deals with everyone resisting the ring.
Yeah.
And how powerful that is, and like how much willpower that takes. And Frodo, this little man, the little halfling, has more bravery, resistance, and power than Gandalf, who openly says what he would do with the ring and openly says that the ring would corrupt him anyway. And yet this young someone just wears it around his chest and doesn't think about using it, and only uses it when he's in danger. And of course the inherent risk of using it, because when you use it, it sends out a beacon basically to the wraiths and to everyone else.
Well said.
So I really, really dig that character, but let's segue as we might. I mean, because I feel like this movie really has dueling protagonists. It's just an ensemble, obviously, but you have Frodo, and then you have, of course, Gandalf, and Gandalf is, played by Ian McKellen. Someone wrote into us and said he was robbed of the Oscar that year. I actually totally agree. I think this performance, I don't know.
I'll have to look. I'll look while you talk.
Yeah, that sounds good. 2001, I think. So, okay, yeah. And I love this, Gandalf the Grey, a really interesting and amazing character, wise, kind. I love the scene of him shooting out the fireworks when he's just in the little wagon in the beginning for the kids. And he loves the Hobbits. He loves Bilbo, and he loves Frodo by proxy. And so I'm wondering what you think of this character. This character obviously always reminds me of Dad. And it's funny because our father loves two fictional characters, I think, more than any: Obi-Wan Kenobi and then Gandalf.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this character, Gandalf, and of course Ian McKellen's very capable performance?
Oh, dude. I mean, where could you even start with Ian? I mean, Sir Ian McKellen, right? I mean, here you have, I think it's important to say that here you have this like old English, classically trained Shakespearean stage and theater actor. So already grounded with the super acting chops. I mean, one of those old school, wonderful English actors that comes out of that tradition. And then he brings, only somebody like him, I think, could impart, himself to a role so successfully like Gandalf. And then, of course, it's important to say the other things he's done that were emblematic, like Magneto and the X-Men and stuff like that. you think of, somebody who's of an older generation like Sir Ian and all that kind of stuff, like the way they're able to embody a role like this, and him saying like he never, even though he grew up English and of course knowing Tolkien, never really knew, maybe read The Hobbit, but never even read the trilogy, was really unfamiliar with this world, was not a fan of the fiction of the novels. So coming in cold and just essentially getting the part of Gandalf. He's we know Gandalf. He's a character sort of imbued with mystique. I mean, such a nuanced character. And something that you reminded me of while you were talking, Kyle, in many ways, Gandalf is a fascinating character too, because he's very Hobbit-like. We know he's fascinated with the Hobbits. We know he's fascinated with the Shire and their little sort of side world that they live in, apparently, like you said, very successfully, like very libertarian-esque in that they're sort of detached. They're sort of isolationists. They're very happy with their little pocket of the world and not being bothered and not bothering anybody else. And Gandalf has that. You could see that he also relishes the same qualities, smoking his pipe, enjoying food and drink, having a cup of tea, enjoying nature, and just enjoying the pleasures of life, the simple pleasures of life. Gandalf has that too. So there's a certain tragedy and responsibility into what he's charged with. Now, I'm still, even though I'm really into the novels, I've been a fan of these things for a long time, the side fiction, the Silmarillion, the explanations of things, I'm still a little confused of the character of Gandalf. And I think that's what makes him cool, because he's a character that's very mysterious. We know essentially, not through the films, but just through investigating on the side, if you're a fan, many of you guys and girls out there will know too, like he was basically an emissary of the gods, put on Earth to deal with shit. And, imbued with certain powers, certain semi-immortality, whatever. He's not human and he's not inhuman. He brings a lot of humanity to a character we find out isn't really human. We find that out in the Two Towers when he comes back as Gandalf the White, spoiler alert. But, there's more to him than just being a human. But but there's so much humanity to the character, and I think that's what grounds him. He makes him fascinating. There's a great, we know he's powerful and he's mysterious, and he's got this great wisdom, and he's sort of an anchor for everybody in his life, whether it be the hobbits or the party, the fellowship themselves or whatever. But he also has, a warmth and an empathy, and he cares for his friends. So he's he's very Obi-Wan Kenobi in that way. He's just very likable. There's a charm, there's a magnetism, there's a charisma. And I think part of that is his job, to win over, to be persuasive, to be comforting. He's trying to put a team together to take care of shit, to deal with evil. And, you see those same charms in his fellow wizard, in Saruman, who's like pretty much the head of the order when the film starts, and considered the most powerful, even more so powerful than Gandalf. But you see those same charms in him, that he's got the golden tongue. He knows what to say. He knows when to say it. He knows how to win people over and all that kind of stuff. Just a fascinating character. And again, so textured, so multi-leveled. And to be able to walk into this like Ian McKellen did and just make that role his. It's important to say too, like Gandalf was portrayed in the few works of fiction that we got springing out of the books in earlier decades. John Huston played Gandalf in Rankin and Bass's The Hobbit, made for TV animated film. And John Huston's voice, first of all, you start with John Huston's voice. It's an awesome portrayal. And then I talked about in our books episode, my beloved 1981 BBC radio dramas of The Lord of the Rings, which were heavily inspirational to this trilogy of films, which Peter Jackson never talks about, and I'm really aggravated by that. And again, don't forget, Ian Holm plays Frodo in those, comes back to play Bilbo in these films. But I love how that goes full circle, and I know that's why they got him for this. So, and Michael Hordern plays Gandalf in those radio plays, which if you guys never heard, listen, they're amazing. And Michael Hordern is awesome. Talk about an old English Shakespearean actor. So it's been done before, but to be able to bring it to the role of not just a voiceover actor, to bring the visuals, the visual component of portraying Gandalf, along with the voice, along with, sort of how you intimate, how you talk, the language. I wonder about it. Actually, is it easier to play just the voice, or is it harder? Because now you're not you know, if you're Michael Hordern or if you're John Huston, you're only saddled with the oral, you know, with the voice, and you don't have the physical, visual components aren't your responsibility. You could sit there and record in your robe and slippers, but you also can't use the visual things as a crutch. You can't use the hat, you know, the telltale pointed hat and the robe and the staff and your interactions with those things as a crutch for it. So I wonder what's harder. But can you even think of anything that Ian McKellen, can you even think of another person for this role? I mean, that's how great he is.
That's why I think the casting is so great. I mean, even when because there were certain people in it where I was like, I totally forgot you were in this. When Liv Tyler pops up, for instance, and I was talking to Micah, and I really want to talk about her experience with this film later because she had never seen it, and I really want to discuss how seminal this was for her. Yeah, I mean, she was floored, and when Liv Tyler popped up, I was like, wow, like, I'm like, do you know who that is? I'm like, that's Steven Tyler's daughter, and she's 10 years younger than me, so we grew up in different times, and I'm like, Liv Tyler at one time was huge, and then she kind of just disappeared, and I feel like this was one of the last seminal roles she did. It's the same thing we were talking about with why can't I think of Elijah Wood, where I only knew him from Deep Impact before Lord of the Rings, which is I love Deep Impact, where he plays like the kid that discovers the asteroid. And so it is when you go through like beat by beat on, you know, Orlando Bloom and so on and so forth, right? And just you know, Viggo Mortensen and, you know, Billy Boyd and all, you know, Dominic Monaghan, who would eventually become very famous for Lost just a couple of years after this. Kate Blanchett's in this, and like it's very weird. And when these people kept popping up, I'm like, holy shit. That's the point. I can't think of anyone that would play any of these roles. I know, other than, you know, Christopher Lee, and it's like it's not a man. It's so they did a wonderful job. And could you imagine someone else playing these characters? Sure, and we can go and put up a fictional cast, but none of them will be as good on paper, even as this one was. And you got to give them a lot of credit for this.
Absolutely, dude. Absolutely.
You got to give them a lot of credit.
You know, there were people being considered. I know that there was a lot of sort of hangups with Ian McKellen because he was already, you know, sort of dedicated to a singer and X-Men movies and all that kind of stuff. And they got pushed back and he didn't know if he could do it. They had other people on the list that were going to play the role up until very late, I think, where they didn't think he could do it. But so it's amazing to think how it could have turned out. It's one of those things of like, it would have been, you know, it would have been so different. It would have been so different than what we actually got.
Let me ask you this, Dig. Because we have these letters here from the audience that get into a few different things, but I want to start, I mean, kind of broad with a Matthew Mandillo inquiry from Patreon. Matthew wrote in on Patreon, patreon.com/laststandmedia. You can support us there. He says, hello, I actually started rewatching Fellowship the other day. I was born in 1993, so these films were perfect for a nerdy kid like me. I have so much nostalgia for seeing each one in the theater, playing video games and collecting figures. Looking back, the series seemed to take the world by storm. How do you think such high fantasy was able to bridge the gap in the mainstream so well? Thanks for your thoughts, and remember, one does not simply walk into Mordor. That's true. By the way, watching the film too, I was reminded, I kept laughing over and over again because I'm like, there are literally 25 or 30 famous memes.
Oh my God.
From this movie.
Absolutely.
Like when they're throwing in the ring and he's like, no, just those scenes of everyone.
There's
like
so many.
There's a million of them, and I just kept dying. I'm like, I totally forgot where these even came from because I think of them more as memes now than anything else. But this is the thing I'm interested in. You had brought this up earlier, which is the idea of how important, and people know this, about how important something like Star Wars was in 77, 80, 83, to getting sci-fi away from the B movies and from the more nerdy Star Trek-esque sci-fi into something a little bit better, right? And it can't, I know I beat this drum a lot, but it can't be understated how this stuff wasn't in mainstream culture 25 years ago. No. You know, and how this film series from Peter Jackson paved the way for the acceptance of something like Game of Thrones. And so I'm wondering, what do you think about, like, think about your mother-in-law or something, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful woman. Right? Or just think about like randos in your life. Yeah. And they sit down and they watch this. I feel like everyone would get something out of it. I don't feel like it's very weird that there's like a dragon firework, or that there's like an orc or orcs, and there are, it makes it also accessible. So you don't feel like you're reading high fantasy from really obscure writers, but instead something that makes it culturally acceptable and lays out a carpet, as it were, so that others can now walk down and produce these concepts that would otherwise not be acceptable to mainstream society. I think that it's a huge push. This movie series is just, I don't know how else it can be stated how important it is that people open their minds to fantasy through this. So what do you think about that? And that we're not talking about, see, this to me is much more high fantasy than Game of Thrones. So this is a much more inaccessible level of fantasy. And yet, because, we both love Game of Thrones. I mean, we talk about it all the time.
God.
The supernatural elements of Game of Thrones are minimal. Yeah. That's what makes it so interesting.
Yes.
Right? The rumors of what could be, the rumors of the winter, the rumors of the White Walkers and the dragons and all of that, and people that can, the Red Lady and all that kind of stuff, and people that can use magic, but it's everywhere in this world. So it's much more supernatural. I'm wondering, how do you interpret that as being such a mainstream cultural phenomenon? It seems wildly inaccessible. It would be as if Interstellar, another film we love, very scientific film, all about reality, was something that made everyone love science. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or space travel.
That's a great point.
But that movie didn't do that, like as wonderful as it is. So what do you think about that?
That's a really great point. I really love that. I think there's a lot to be said about that. It's interesting about Game of Thrones because I'm rewatching it now. Helene's watching it for the first time. We're almost to the Red Wedding. We're like an episode away. And I'm trying to warn her. I'm like,
dude, I remember seeing the Red Wedding for the first time. I was laying in bed in San Francisco watching, because I'd watch it on TiVo or on, DVR like later that night. And I remember sitting up and being like, what the fuck? And I was by myself. So yeah, you got to warn everyone for that.
Dude, I was just, it ripped my guts out. I almost, no pun, I almost stopped watching, especially because I was so in love with the young wolf. Man crush, maybe, partially.
Sure. He's great.
Yeah, I was so in love with that character, his rage and his, all the texture and his the complexity of that character, that it was, and it's not just him, obviously, but that gets the sword during that episode. But yeah, man, so I'm watching that again, and it reminds me, like, I know just from really going on George Martin deep dives how inspired he was by Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, but also you can't come through fantasy without coming through Tolkien. It's impossible. He didn't create it, but he set the tone for what it would be, what it would evolve into. All the, all of the ins and outs, all of the, telltale, all the characterizations. I mean, all the fixings, right? Everything about it. He sort of, breathed life into what it would become. And I think there's a lot to say about it. I think that, you talk about my mother-in-law, somebody of that generation, the baby boomer generation. I think they already had things that we referred to earlier in the sword and sorcery type realm, although it wasn't high fantasy or fantasy like we know it today in Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones and stuff, JRPGs, stuff like that. But they already had the Three Musketeers and Robin Hood, and King Arthur certainly was a big one. And maybe even things like Greek mythology or Beowulf or something like that. So they already had those fairy tales. They already had a little bit of that relatability and those things, the trappings that would come out of, could be pulled out of any one of those things. And then, you had other things. You had, starting with D&D in the 70s and 80s, and how that was, even when it started, was really, we talk about freaks and geeks, right? It was really particular to a certain nerd culture, and it was frowned upon largely by society for Satanism and all the other ridiculous bullshit. But it already, D&D was already ratcheting up, and then you had things like Magic the Gathering and other fantasy type things, and RPG/JRPG games starting with the 8-bit generation that, of course, came out of Ultima and Exodus and all that kind of stuff. But so fantasy was already establishing a thing with the young people. I think the older people already had their touchstones that they could bring into it. And then I think, combined with those two things, I think what Tolkien does in the books initially, and then what Peter Jackson does in the films so successfully, is really, again, grounding it with a human element. a familiarity, a relatability. You have the hero, you have the asshole, you have the betrayer, you have the seemingly insignificant person that, you know, everybody has to become the hero that the world relies upon. You have all those touchstones for people to relate to, besides just the seemingly otherworldly, fantastic, maybe even bizarre things. The elves with the pointy ears and the dwarves and their underground mines and dragons and balrogs and all this other crazy shit. You ground it with these characters that are not only likable, but are relatable. And I think that's what, you know, and even sort of taking Gandalf's magic and showing a real restraint with it, like George Martin does later with Game of Thrones, where it's like, we're going to keep a mystique around that. We're not, even with dragons, it's like not a huge part. It is, but it's not a huge part of what they do. They handle it with, you know, they handle it with a bit of restraint. And I think that's really a telltale thing that Martin takes into Game of Thrones, that, you know, it's like, that's not the point. Those are certain trappings of the story, the magic, the mystique, you know, again, the dragons and the fire-breathing monsters and Sauron himself.
And my man that can light his sword on fire. It's still my favorite thing.
So when those things happen, when you meet a Beric and a Thoros of Mir, right, and you see the flaming sword and stuff, it's like, holy shit. Those moments are really punctuated because you don't get a lot of it. And they also don't. I love Beric so much. You warned me about that character before I even met him, and of course I fell in love with him. But that's the thing. That's what makes it so striking, is when you do get those moments, when you do get, what do they call the fire in that, when they firebomb the fleet? You know, where it's like the Meisters, it's like you don't see that a lot. You know, you don't get a lot of that. So when you do get it, it's really striking. It's really pronounced. And again, it's not about that. It's about the characters. It's about relating to these characters and maybe even seeing yourself in one of those characters, you know?
Yeah. Dragon's Flames is the green fire. That's,
you know, like stuff like that, like all those magical elements that we first learned in D&D and our beloved JRPG games, starting back with, you know, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy.
I love that you brought up Ultima, by the way, too, because we're not PC Western gamers, so that's not something we were exposed to until late. That was also percolating at that time, so definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, dude.
It's interesting because and even comparing like the dragons, which come up when we talk about Game of Thrones, I love that they have the 3 eggs, for instance, of the dragons, but people don't even believe that they're real.
Yeah.
Like as they meet them until they hatch. So I love that. That's what's so fun about writing. And well, wasn't it Picasso that said great artists steal, right?
Yeah.
The idea that like and it's true. Like I remember being a musician and hearing when I was in a band and played drums and just certain things, certain beats, certain textures. There's this thing that, I mean, even there's this thing people might know that you wouldn't know, but there's a song by a band named Chevelle called Family System, which I really love. And there's just this thing like where it's about to like go off, like it's like building up and then the drummer just hits the ride cymbal, just goes ding, ding. And then everyone and I totally stole that and put it in one of my songs, you know, because it's like awesome. So like, you know, great artists steal, and it's cool to see people develop something. And with George Martin developing his own world that's actually becoming much more detailed, I think, to the point where I don't think anyone believes he's going to finish his books. In fact, he just announced like more stories with HBO. It's like, dude, just finish your fucking book.
He's fascinating. He's really a fascinating dude. I really have grown to like him by listening to his interviews, because he's very articulate. He knows what he wants to say. He knows his world and what he's creating inherently, and he could talk about it. He's not awkward in an interview. Like, he could articulate his vision, but he's one of those dudes, or dudettes, in this case dudes, where he was given almost too much power. You know, it's like he's not beholden to anybody. There is no publishing company. There is no media company that's going to tell this man what to do. Whatever he creates is going to spin, forget gold, platinum, and people will wait for it. You know, they're going to wait. He's going to do whatever the hell he wants.
The series had to get ahead of his books famously, and are not the canon ending of the story, which makes it even more fascinating, especially because that last season sucks.
Oh,
so
it's so disappointing.
It was like,
really,
especially the battle where you couldn't see anything the entire episode. That was my favorite. So, Dig, let's talk about the ring, the One Ring, right? I wrote in my notes here, ring equals hot potato, What I love about this is no one wants it.
Well,
everyone is tempted by it. And I brought up earlier, I'm kind of interested for you to kind of reflect on the different times people resist the ring. And I really feel like this is one of the powerful things, an inanimate object with a really deep history. I love the visual of the ring, the elvish script that comes and goes, the resizing of the ring. I love that shot when it's on, you know, one creature and then it's in the human's hand and then it shrinks, right? And you can't resist it. And we see the most powerful, like you said, godlike, demi-godlike Gandalf not only admit that he would become bad with it. So that was the big thing that I think I walked away from that I never even pulled out of the book, is like Gandalf saying, I'm more powerful than all of you and I can't resist this. Therefore, none of you need this and we need to destroy it. Because if I can't resist it and I know what it is more than you, some imperfect hobbit or human's going to put it on and fuck everything up. And I love the idea, especially about how humans are at the very epicenter of why this thing still exists, and how the humans are the bad guy, and not the bad guys, but kind of it's almost like, we remember when we talked about Mass Effect, when we did the Mass Effect episode, about how the aliens just don't trust the humans, right? Like they're the new kid on the block. They're the ones that are ignorant, power hungry and all of that. It's a similar thematic element in Lord of the Rings, I think. What do you think about the symbol of the ring? What do you think about the symbol of what it means, watching people resist it, and this quest for this small inanimate object? They reflect upon it. It's just a ring, you know? It's nothing. It's something that Frodo had in his, or Bilbo had in his possession for decades.
Yeah.
And he knew what it was, but no one even came for it. No one knew it was there. I mean, the ring disappears for 50, 100, 200, 500 years at a time. And so what are your reflections on the ring?
Yeah, and so, if you started with The Hobbit, something that was a side story. You know, they were going on this quest to reclaim a treasure from a dragon, and the ring was sort of something that was found along the way. So, you know, initially not the center of the story, by all means, a fascinating part of the story, but certainly not the main part of the story. In The Hobbit, it's funny, I think back again to what I started with earlier in the conversation, you know, being that 8-year-old kid in the middle of the bed, mom and dad's bed in the morning on a Saturday morning, and thinking like, I remember having this thought of like, Lord of the Rings, like these 3 thick books are about a ring, like a ring on the finger. Like that can't be, like, thinking in my head, like, are they talking about like the rings of Saturn or the ring as like a ring of people? Like it can't be about a ring. And I love that it does. This story centers around this seemingly tiny, insignificant thing. This whole battle, this whole grandiose story of good versus evil involving thousands of people and multiple races of people and this whole world, and the way that the entire world is balanced on this knife, on this razor's edge of a conflict, is centered around this ring, you know, this tiny thing that you wear on your finger. First of all, I love the shape-shifting thing. You know, you see Sauron in the beginning wearing the ring on his giant, you know, he's like 8 feet tall and he's using this 10-foot tall, you know, mace, and he's just taking people out. Like his ring finger looks like the size of a human's wrist. So the way that could kind of shapeshift and has those magical qualities, but again, shown with restraint, which makes it really interesting. They never explain it really, which makes it very intriguing. But I just love this whole thing. I think that is the most fascinating part of the ring. First of all, this seemingly insignificant person, this no-name hobbit living in the middle of the earth somewhere that nobody knows about, an unimportant figure in the world being saddled with this great responsibility, is a fascinating part. And Frodo, you know, initially Bilbo, but now Frodo is a fascinating part of the story. And then again, seeing this seemingly small, insignificant prop, you know, pull people apart with its burden. We see the effect it's had on Bilbo, which is really tragic. You know, we see that this thing basically tore him apart and made him age since it was in his possession, and he was transfixed by it and basically put in a trance by it. He was like zombie-like for it. He basically lived for this thing. And the way it sort of, you know, rotted him, basically, which was really interesting physically and emotionally and mentally. And then, like you said, Kyle, its thing as seeing as the most powerful figures in the world, right? Gandalf, this would-be King and Aragorn and Galadriel, one of the most powerful elves. They don't really show it with Elrond so much, although Elrond in the little prequel bit, 5-minute opening of seeing the initial battle with Elrond and Isildur versus Sauron, you see Elrond tell Isildur, like, throw it in, like, get rid of it, like, that thing's fucked.
That's one of the memes.
And he's just like, no.
Because people always just put that thing, like, do something, and then it's like, no. You know.
I mean, can you imagine? I mean, that's one of the best. That's probably one of the best ones, actually. I forgot about that. So good. But, you know, even Galadriel, like, you see her, you know, like, they're putting themselves, these powerful figures, the most powerful, like, proponents of good in the world are tested by this thing. And you could see, like, even with Galadriel, like, she's testing herself. She doesn't know what the result's going to be. And she's like, you know, like, we see how powerful she is leading up to that moment since we meet her. And she's like, you know, relieved at the end, like, I passed the test. Like,
right. It's awesome. I love it.
You know,
like,
it's
she
like,
did it to
wow,
herself.
like, what the fuck is this thing?
Right.
And, you know, I love also the fact that they don't really talk about, but that's implied, is that it's so clever on Gandalf's behalf to recruit Frodo and the Hobbits for this purpose, because they're a race of people not beholden to and don't exhibit this lust for power like man does. Like, they're sort of immune to it in a way, because they're so pure of heart. They're not preoccupied by all the trappings of power and wealth and all this kind of stuff. They just love the simple things in life. So they are the perfect, you know, they are the perfect vehicle for getting rid of this thing, because they're not corrupted by it, which is so cool.
And shout out, by the way, to Elrond, that I do want to bring up in the beginning. One of my very favorite shots in the entire movie is near the beginning. When I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, I remember liking this, which was Elrond Hubbard, that I like to call him. He's fighting in this monumental battle 2,500 years ago or whatever, and there's an arrow that's being shot. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, and it passes by his face, and it you know, does like the
from the troops behind him.
Right. It's awesome. Like, there's just little touches like that I love, but it is cool watching everyone struggle with the ring, except for the people that in some way their ignorance keeps them, you know, their ignorance of what it can do and how it can better their lives. I think it's interesting because, like, even Merry and Pippin they don't try to steal the ring in Fellowship or anything. There's nothing crazy going on with them. They're the trustworthy stewards, even though they have no power, no super intelligence, no touch with nature or anything that any of these other, you know, no wealth like the dwarves or anything like that. Like, they're at least tempted by it. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating about how it was forged with these other rings, and you learn about Mount Doom, and you learn about Mordor and all of that. And even looking at the map, I was, you know, Mordor, I remember thinking as I was a kid too, Mordor is in the east, and it's surrounded by like a U-shaped mountain range. And I'm always like, why don't you just go around and go on the East Coast? But nonetheless, I love the ring in terms of just the resistance and it being the obvious object. It's kind of rare in a way where you get a name like Lord of the Rings, like we're saying, right? And then it really, like you said, it does become about this piece of gold jewelry and how it corrupts everyone that it touches. And we even see Gollum.
Yeah.
From
very important.
The Hobbit as well in there, played by Andy Serkis. I mean, very famous role, but everyone wants this thing. And this is one of the themes that I wanted to touch on, Dig, which was bravery. I feel like we expect the bravery from the warring humans and from the bow-wielding elves and the boisterous dwarves and all of that. But what I love about it, and again, because the film, even the extended edition, which I watched, which is almost 4 hours long, and I'll talk about it in a little while. I think it's almost too long, although I don't mind. And we're going to see what a TV show of this, by the way, looks like when Amazon does it. And I don't know if you saw, Amazon is spending $500 million on the first season.
Oh, so, that's just season 1.
So,
holy shit.
So I don't know why.
Wow.
I don't know why you need to spend that much money, but so I dig this entire kind of bravery approach that is encapsulated in the Hobbits. And Frodo doesn't want this task, yet is willing to accept it because of his love and trust for Gandalf. Sam is spying. I love that scene when he's like, I'm just cutting the grass or whatever. It's like, 3 a.m. and he's thrust into this. And then Merry and Pippin, they're introduced differently, as I recall, in the books than they are in the movie. I don't remember. That doesn't happen like that. I don't remember exactly what happens, but they don't run into them in a field or something. But I love how they're all brave, how they all have each other's back, how there's a real love, affinity, and brotherhood between them. And I was almost wondering, because it is a very male movie, a very male story. There are some females. Typically, we really only see any consequential female characters that are elves up to this point.
Yeah.
That it almost could have been called the Brotherhood of the Ring. And I feel like this is where I wanted to bring Micah in, because this is not my original thought. But she said, this movie, and she only knows that as a movie, she wants to read the books now, but is a really interesting display of male bonding, of male love. And you had brought it up earlier with Sam kind of having a brotherly love, or a bromance with Frodo, or with Frodo. But it's all of them. I love when there's multiple scenes where Frodo's down and out, and they just jump in. I mean, they do it against the Balrog. They do it against, or not the Balrog. No, against, the orcs and all sorts of other things. And they just grab their swords and just run at these creatures. Like, they're brave. They have each other's backs. They don't seem to really think things through. Maybe that's not very smart, but I love the idea of the affinity, the love, the brotherhood that these males exhibit to each other, and how it's a kind of an interesting reflection of reality. Because we all, well, not all of us maybe, but we all have, men when we were boys, and as we become men that are of the same sex, that we have a great love for. It's almost like, I've thought about it in my own mind. Like, I think about Ramon or Mike Pope, and I'm like, I love them. I love them almost like you would love anyone. It's almost like being in love in some way, right?
Sure.
Like, it's just not a sexual or a romantic love, but it's its own kind. Because people are like, well, it's different love and being in love. And I'm like, no, I think we're in love. I just think it's different because it's not a romantic relationship. It's a brotherhood, or a friendship, or a partnership. And I love that that's reflected here. I feel like it's a very powerful sign of male bonding. And I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah. It's so well said, man. It's so easy to think about these films and the performances with Sean Astin and Elijah Wood and the, oh, Sam, oh, Frodo, and make fun of the bromance or whatever. But when you get past
and
all
their
that,
hugs and all that, they're like always jumping at each other, like.
And it is funny. But all teasing aside, that's what this story, I agree with you, is really anchored in. It's friendship. It could almost be called the friendship of the ring. It's a love. It's a mutual love. It's an understanding. It's a desire to share the burden, to help shoulder the load for your fellow, for your companion, for your friend who you really love. I mean, nowhere is it more obvious in the story than Sam's love for Frodo. But it really starts too. You have to remember with Frodo's love and trust, as you said, in Gandalf, Frodo's love for Bilbo. Bilbo says it even in the film. You can't forget, like, this is a very, this is an edited down, sort of simplified version of the book. The book has a lot more breathing room, a lot more nuance, a lot more dialogue, a lot more description. So you're cutting things out of the book. It's very the film, obviously, even the 4-hour version is a very abbreviated version, but you still get that. You still get the bonding, the relationships, and the understandings. Even in this film, the way it's portrayed is really striking too, with the mistrust and the different tracks between Boromir and Aragorn, for instance, where it's like, you see good and bad, and not bad so much, but you get humanity in both of them. Even when Boromir argues for the hobbits who are lamenting, like, they're crying, they're laying on the ground crying when Gandalf dies, and Aragorn's like, we got to get the fuck out of here. And Boromir's like, give them a second. Jesus Christ. You know what I mean? Like, you get humanity between the two characters, but there's mistrust. They have different values. They're seemingly on different paths for what should be done. And you get this great understanding in Boromir's death of, like, I would have, he tells Aragorn, like, I would have followed you to the ends of the earth, like that type of thing, where friendships are even formed really late on and stuff like that. So it does revolve around, the love and the friendship, and the two other, the Merry and Pippin being so not just Sam, being really faithful to and loyal to Frodo too, and going along on this perilous quest with him. Again, two characters who are not equipped for this. So, and where did each one of them, you see they derive their courage and their bravery from something, from some source. Is it a love for, is it Aragorn's love for Arwen, who would otherwise be, immortal and go on to live a life without being saddled by this relationship? Is it, Sam's love, which you could intimate that this has been going on since they were kids, that they were, no, Sam didn't start loving Frodo the day before this quest started. So the history there, is it, Frodo's love for his uncle Bilbo, who raised him, Bilbo and Frodo's love for Gandalf? There's so much texture there. Legolas and Gimli's friendship that's forged out of, old grudges between elves and dwarves who historically really don't like each other, a very France and England type relationship there, uneasy
is
allies.
Is that where that comes from?
I don't know. Tolkien still supposedly maintains that this was not a World War II, analogy or story in any way, but I can't understand that. There's so much in it, but I always saw the dwarves and the elves as a very France, England, maybe even France, United States type of thing, where you're at the core, you have the same values, you have a common enemy, but there's just so much there that, maintains that wall, that grudge is still there.
Right. There's there's definitely an allegory. There's got to be an allegory.
There's got to be some sort of allegory there between the two, I would think. Even if, who knows with Tolkien, he's so interesting in all this because obviously created this, but maybe a lot of it was even, especially if you think about the time it was written, maybe a lot of it just found its way in without being intentional. It's also really interesting to know about Tolkien that he was such a purist, such a naturalist, really salt of the earth. Supposedly didn't like television, didn't like movies, didn't like, he was really, really, maybe even a nudist. I don't know. Maybe. Who knows? But
put that out there.
But, it's so funny that this came, that could also be part of the conversation and why the media sprang so late out of these famous books. But, when you think about friendship, that's what really grounds it for me, and that, I remember thinking like those certain scenes in this film, like when Gandalf dies and they're sort of crying outside and you see the emotion, you see Perry crying in Merry's lap. You see even Gimli like trying to get back in there and Boromir's like, we got to go back for his body or whatever. And Boromir's holding him back. And you see, the way Frodo's walking away and the tears streaming down his cheek or whatever. It's not, I remember thinking like at the time, like this is what I needed from the Star Wars prequels. This is the emotional weight that I wanted to see. I don't want to just see, I love seeing the badass fight scenes. I love seeing the creatures and the dragons and the Balrogs and all that crazy shit. But ground it with the emotion, like what's going on here with these characters, are invested in this life or death quest, not just for themselves, but for the place where they live. If they don't get this done, it's fucking over. And the emotional weight that goes in with, especially the characters who weren't built for this, so to get that sort of thing and, what's driving them is their love for each other and their friendship. That's the motivating force behind everything here. It would have been cool, to get more female characters. I think about that in the, Arwen's really important. I like the way they play her up in this too. And I love the elven magic and all that kind of stuff. It's really neat. Again, shown with restraint, but really just enough mystique to make you want more, but they don't really give you that much more. It's kind of neat. But, again, too, like, and also with, not saying, okay, we're going to take the most badass, let's get the most badass warrior, the most storied fighter from each of these places and then pit them against each other and find out, or maybe put them together and send them out. It's like, no, we're going to get these seemingly unimportant people, in the Hobbits, and then give them a couple of people, like give them the soldier from Mirkwood and give them this guy from the White City. He's kind of a powerful warrior and stuff. Put them together. It's an unlikely alliance. And to form friendships out of that is also really meaningful. And it really, again, speaks to our probably experiences as just people on Earth, as what they're dealing with in Middle Earth is like, these unlikely friendships can form out of situations, a common enemy, fighting a common threat, all of these things. It's like all of these things we don't even think about why we love these stories so much, but that's certainly a big part of the whole thing.
definitely. And I do want to know more, and I know that it's out there. I mean, the thing about preparing for this episode was this story and Tolkien has been so overanalyzed at this point that I didn't want to even read any of that stuff, like about, because we've talked about the allegories and all that about war, and I think for me, I think it's more simple. I feel like it's just about humans, about the imperfect nature of man, how they're responsible in this story. They're responsible for this, and no one else is. And it's the human characters that show the least propensity to resist the ring, and we see that in the woods in Fellowship, you know. And so I feel like there is something to be gleaned from this story that's well beyond the realm of Middle Earth and the ring and their own story. I just don't know exactly what it is, and as an adult, I'm eager to kind of move on and watch the other films and maybe go back and read the books sometime. And I'm sure we'll get to all that on the show eventually. But to kind of feel like as a man, as opposed to a boy, when I read them when I was 16 or whatever, what do you glean out of them? What do you think they're about? And I do think they're about something far deeper than the fantasy itself, which is, of course, very appealing to everyone. But I like knowing what things, you know, I'm more unsuccessfully doing it in my own writing and games, where, you know, when I wrote Twinbreaker is a allegory, is an anti-war story. Now, no one gets that because the writing wasn't good enough, but that was the intention. And so I wonder what his intent really was.
It's true. I love what you said, though, Colin. I never hear that said about the Lord of the Rings in general, be it the books, the films, spin-off content, video games, any of it, is that there is a timelessness there and classic themes, because we always think about what are the World War II allegories. We got the Eagles, we got the France-England thing with the elves and the dwarves. We got all these things, all these trappings, but it's true.
The Eagles are supposed to be Americans, right?
Right. The Eagles come in and swoop in and rescue them in their greatest time of need and all these kind of things. And it almost seems unmistakable. But then you think, not only, all right, how much of it just kind of made its way and meandered its way in just naturally into his writing anyway, into what they were dealing with in the world at the time he was writing it, but also that, again, like you said so perfectly, these are sort of, there's a timelessness and to these classic themes that date back far prior to World War II. Just in thinking about man on Earth, wars, conflict, times of peace, ancient grudges, whatever it is, these things date back way prior to World War II, and you see them in stories that date back far prior to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So I love that point, and you could kind of maybe artificially put it to bed in just saying that, like, these are classic themes that date back way prior to the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and what the world was dealing with, the Axis versus the Allies.
Well, if you think about the Bible, especially the New Testament, it's the same thing, where like these stories, these parables of the way Jesus treated people and the poor and the sick and all that, like those are 2,000-year-old parables about how to treat people, you know?
Absolutely.
And so some things, and we say this over and over again on the show for people that listen to it, but you know, it was Spielberg that said, like, what, there are 6 stories or something like that. I think that there are only 6 types of stories or something to tell, and you do the best you can with those.
Yeah,
you know?
Those are at the core of every story. There's those 6 or 7 things, and then it's just about what trappings you surround those with to tell your story, basically.
So, Dick, I want to, as an artist, I want to ask you a little bit about the special effects. And Matt Zolkowski wrote into us about this and says, "I'm so excited, easily one of my favorite movies ever. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on the effects. They use such a variety from the very old perspective and physical effects to the high-end CG of the time." So I have a 4K 70-inch HDR TV, and I rented it on Amazon and watched it, and I thought it looked good. It wasn't in 4K Ultra HD or whatever, but because you can't stream that, but it looked great. And I was really shocked, actually, because I really feel like Peter Jackson and company were able to identify something that Lucas wasn't able to identify in episode 1, and that plagued the rest of the movies, and that maybe they looked at and were like, we can't do this. So because they weren't filming, I think, until later in 99, So they had a little bit of time to learn from episode 1, which came out in May of 1999. And so I actually feel like there's a few things to say. Number one, I think that the special effects largely look good. There are a few scenes that don't look good. And actually the scenes that don't look great are the scenes where the backgrounds are fake. That was what I noticed. There's a few scenes where they're clearly on green screen and it looks bad.
Yeah.
But a lot of the special effects and all that look great. I think the other thing is that they really stuck with something that Lucas just eschewed, which was practical effects, about building sets, about... Now they have extras for size. That's one of the things they play with in the game or in the movie. They obviously have a lot of, if you really pay attention to the film, there are a lot of close-up shots because clearly the hobbits are half the size of the humans and they're played by humans and it's just a complicated thing. So there's a lot of tricks. And when you really look at it, you can tell that it's filmed around them. But I was kind of taken aback in a good way about how much it lined up, because even though the film came out about 20 years ago,
yeah,
they were doing this stuff in 99 and 2000 to prepare. So this is actually like pre 9/11 CG technology. Like now ILM was doing this stuff too, but just not as well. I'm wondering what you think about pulling this forward to 2021 when we're recording this, what you think about the way the movie looks.
It was a large part of what I was paying attention to going in, because it had been a while since I've watched one of these in their entirety. And you know, once in a while I'll pop in a clip, one of my favorite clips from the movies, but I haven't watched one from start to finish from A to Z in a while. And, you know, knowing this was the first one too, being especially sensitive to that. And I was amazed by how well it held up. I mean, again, like we mentioned earlier, the evolution of visual technology and animation and visual effects and everything like that has really, year to year, I mean, the difference that they could make, the difference that's made, the strides that they make in that world is pretty remarkable. But thinking back 20 years, it holds up really, really well, I think. There are some things where you could see in the VFX, like when you have big batches of orcs, you could see the batching and the clumping. You could see the repetition, you know, if you're really paying attention. To, you know, especially in those crazy scenes where you see hundreds of orcs crawling down the pillars and stuff, you could see it would be handled differently now. Like you're saying, with the green screening and in merging the tech and the live action, you could see things that would sort of lead your eye astray, like the shadowing in the compositing doesn't look quite right on the green screen, something that they would make look much better now. But for the most part, it doesn't take you out of the film. And I think that's important, how well it holds up. I know, you know, it's Weta. They were way ahead of their time. So there's always that, you know, one of the best VFX companies that the world's ever known. So they were already light years ahead. So you have that little time period where everybody else was catching up. So it was them. So you had some of the best VFX artists in the world doing this. The things that bother me in this movie, crazily enough, are the choices, I think, that don't have much to do with the VFX or the handling of the visuals. Like the scene where Galadriel may be corrupted by the ring and she's doing that thing where it goes to blue and it's sort of
it looks horrible.
It's really just a bad choice. You know, I think you had to be sensitive in crafting the film, not just with the filming, but with the editing and stuff, and saying, like, even 4 hours, this is a big book with a lot of content, a lot of story, a lot of characters, a lot of nuance. And the books largely, I would say with the exception of maybe Two Towers, really take their time with how things play out, and they build up relationships and they build up story, and they give you backstory and origin and all that kind of stuff. When you're speeding it along, even at a 4-hour clip, you got to be sensitive to the choices you make. And that was just a weird one for me. It was like, okay, you built up Galadriel. We know she's this mythical being. They meet her. She's a seer. She's a visionary. She could look into your soul, all these crazy things. And then you're dealing with this thing of like trying to show like the ring could even corrupt her. How are we going to handle this? We only have like a minute and a half. Like that was just a weird choice. But again, that's not the technology. That was just a weird decision to make in that moment. I think you could have done it better 100 other ways.
No, I'm glad you brought that scene up, because that scene does look like
right.
ass.
It's just weird.
Yep.
It's a weird choice. It's very fast. You know, it ratchets up from like 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. All of a sudden, maybe she's evil. Then she comes back down. It's like really jarring. And there's actually a lot of those moments in this where it's like, you feel like it's so crazy, even a 4-hour movie, if you know the books well, I think I would argue if you do know the books well, even a 4-hour movie, to me, it felt fast. I was like, it's missing out on all this kind of crazy stuff. Like,
I agree.
It's, it's skipping beats and the rhythm seems speedy at times because they have a lot to fit in even in 4 hours. But yeah, visually, I think it's awesome. One thing I found out, which was so cool that I didn't know, were 2 illustrators, Alan Lee and John Howe. If you guys have older versions of the books, and maybe they still use their artwork on the newer printings, Ballantine and such, that these guys were the initial illustrators involved in the publishing of the books and the calendars through the years before this was like a media franchise, a huge multi-million, billion-dollar media franchise. Alan Lee and John Howe were just illustrators, old-timey illustrators. I think they were one was born in the 40s and one was born in the 50s, that they were, as young men, they did all the illustration for the book covers and calendars and stuff. They recruited those 2. Peter Jackson reached out and got those 2 to come in and art direct the films. So they did a lot of the previs. They did a lot of the art direction, conceptual design, designed the characters, designed the way Rivendell would look, designed the way Lothlorien would look. And you could see, if you look at the classic illustrations, they're very stylized, but you could see the palettes. You could see the design elements, certain cues embedded into the world, which I thought was a really clever touch because it takes the world that we knew prior to the films, to the new line of Miramax films, and sort of reach their hand back into whatever we got in the past and sort of tied that in with the creation of how the films would look, which was really so cool. And the other thing is I get nervous just thinking about the burden that Peter Jackson and his people were charged with in making this. Again, not ever really having anything except the animated versions by Rankin and Bass and Tolkien, which are much different and much lower budget. So to go in with a movie studio and a big budget and marquee actors and the best visual effects people and artistic people in the business and be charged with creating for the first time a live action rendition of these beloved books. It would almost be if Star Wars got really popular in novel form over a certain amount of decades and then somebody was like, all right, make the movie out of it now. And it's that beloved. It's like, whoa, like you're saddled with a huge responsibility and that thing of like, how do we make everybody happy? How do we bring the people in, like you said earlier, Kyle, that don't really know about sword and sorcery, that don't really know about role playing, that don't have any really entry into this world, and how do we get the fans as well and make everybody happy? This might be one of the most successful projects ever in that it made 95% of people happy.
Everyone was happy.
That's a huge.
Dad was the touchstone for me with that, and when he was happy.
Yeah, right. That's a great point. And that's a stunt. I mean, to pull that off, I mean, that's like an Evel Knievel-like stunt in the movie world. Like if you're pulling that off, it's almost impossible. And again, it's not just Peter Jackson. It's not just his vision. It's the people behind the camera. It's the, we talked about the actors and actresses that were down for the vision and just got it. Everybody just got it. It's like so, and I don't want to go into the Star Wars prequels and stuff, but it's like the opposite of that. It's like where you feel this is the opposite, and we got it almost around the same time, where it's like, everybody got it. Like for some reason, whether it was the leadership, whether they were just luckily all on the same page with a combination of those things, whatever it was, everybody involved just got it, what it needed to be, what it needed this translation to be, to come out of the books and feel like they were, that it was faithful to the books, but also could work in a visual medium and all that. So just remarkable. And the visual effects is a huge part of that. It almost, again, we talk about having a campy's 1950s version would have been fun, because not only because of the primitive effects that we would have got back then, it would have been all practical, but also to get like those John Wayne-esque performances, very stylized performances, treating everything that was like fiction as campy back then. The whole mentality behind it would have been different. But it also makes me realize like these Amazon projects, budget aside, it's going to be really interesting because they have the money. I don't know what the casting is like, but I haven't paid attention to that, but I'm sure they're going to get everybody they want. Now they're saddled with the responsibility of living up to the Peter Jackson filmic cinema versions, feature film versions, and that's going to be, it's going to be tricky, man. You're going to have to I wonder what it's going to be, because not only do you have that responsibility to develop to, but you have Game of Thrones, which was an episodic TV fantasy over multiple seasons that's beloved.
Right. That's why they want this, by the way. I mean, it's obvious. They want a Game of Thrones.
I hope they don't go the route of making it more gritty like Game of Thrones was. That works for Game of Thrones world with the sex and the politics and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally different.
I don't want them to go into that realm, but I wonder how they're going to set it apart. I do wonder about that. It's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, this seems to be a project. This Amazon project seems to be a project that is born simply out of chasing something. Everyone saw what HBO had with this fucking golden goose, and that's going to continue to lay eggs for them for decades, because they're going to do all the spinoffs now.
Yeah.
And they want, so Amazon went for the next best thing, which is Tolkien. So I think what's unfortunate about it is that I don't think it's starting from the right place, because I don't really think we need these. And yet, watching the films, even at 4 hours, I'm like, there is something missing here. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So that's the one exciting part about the Amazon project, but it is obviously going to be compared to the Jackson work, and we're going to find out how that all works out. But one of the things I loved about the design too is just the use of color, and also kind of the thematic elements of, like, I mean, it makes sense in a way, but the Shire, everything's short, squat, round, right? Not high off the ground. Makes sense. But when you go and you see the elves, and you see everything from their ears to their bows to the buildings all curved, meet with straight lines, right? And all these kinds of things. It's almost like and a lot of white, their hair, the buildings, the ethereal nature, the washed out nature of the color, all of that. So I do dig how they deal with that too. And then we don't see much of the dwarves. We see the Mines of Moria, and we obviously know Gimli, but things are a little darker, a little grittier, a little shorter, a little gruffer. So I do like how they play with those things and make them all feel like cultures that exist amongst each other. And like you said earlier, have strife with each other, and yet have to work with one another in order to get things done. But the one thing I wanted to ask you here, I mean, there's another thing. I mean, there's a lot of things I still want to ask, but we've been talking about the way the visuals are working in the book, the way they cast really wisely. And yet John wrote into us and said, hello, Dynamic Brothers.
Oh.
If you had read the books, we did, who were the characters whose appearance differed the most, in your opinion, from the film version of what you had imagined in your minds while reading the books? So I have to say, and I remember lamenting this at the time, although it's not really a big deal, is that I can barely remember what I saw in my mind's eye anymore.
Okay.
Because it has been so overtaken by all of this, that it's not like whatever I saw Gandalf as, or whatever I saw, like, I can still kind of see the way I saw Strider and them at the inn and stuff. Like, I have a very vivid memory of reading that part of the book, and how dark, and it was rainy and mysterious, and it was building up to this moment. But generally speaking, I feel like everyone I see is exactly what I think that character is now, which kind of sucks. But it is the way it is, and I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing. I remember even seeing the books being sold with the characters from the movies on the covers, kind of suggesting that to the audience. Do you have a similar problem, or do you kind of do you have like a partition in your mind where you remember what you saw things as when you read them, as opposed to seeing them in the Jackson film?
That's a really great point. I mean, these are presented with so much strength, and they took over. I guess they took over some real estate in our head, these films, right? The Peter Jackson films, that they almost do become all the representations, the costumes, the characters, the settings. They almost become the marquee things in your head and overtake what you remember from the books, because they're so strong and they're so well done. That is kind of a problem. I remember you touched on this a little bit earlier. One thing that sort of bugged me a little bit, and this just falls into the abbreviation and the editing and having to cram this all into 4 hours, is the other Hobbits. Not so much Sam and Frodo, but the Merry and Pippin characters, which two of my favorite characters in the entire trilogy, and we'll get much more of them starting with the Two Towers, and certainly Return of the King, and the way those characters sort of evolve, and the way Merry becomes very wise, and the Pippin's rather sort of growing up arc of going from like this irresponsible, fun-loving, seemingly insignificant to like becoming one of the most courageous and all that kind of stuff. I love those two characters, but the way they barely even touch on the fact that Merry's Frodo's cousin, which I think is kind of an important thing to remember, and also the friendship between Pippin and Merry is really kind of skimmed over a little bit in this first book. We'll get it later on in the movie, rather. We'll get it later on in the other movies because they go off on their own, obviously, starting with the ending of this film, and sort of have their own adventure together. But we kind of miss out on the origins of that and the way they tag along and the way the mishaps happen at the Prancing Pony and Bree, which largely has to do with Pippin, again, with his foibles in the Mines of Moria and stuff like that. And just getting a little more of those two characters, I think that was the one thing that was sort of, they change from the book. Also, that the fact that Merry, if I'm remembering correctly, is a little more, he seems older than the other hobbits, even from the beginning. Like, he seems a little more responsible and a little more dour. Like, I remember him going off on his own and like a little bit more of an introvert of a character, even though obviously he loves his cousin and he's down to go on this quest and he doesn't want to, again, that friendship and love of not wanting this person to have to undertake or shoulder a mission on their own. I remember him being a little more defined in the first book, where they had to skim over the character just because they, it's the same thing as the world, Kyle. You said it so well already with the wardrobing and the costuming in this movie is amazing. We can't.
Definitely.
It's unbelievable. You almost take it for granted. It's so good. It's like, oh yeah, that's the way it should be. No, that took a lot of work. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's work and effort and vision. Yeah.
But also in being charged of presenting this world, because we know Middle Earth is very Earth-like, but you have to sort of present it as a little more picturesque, a little more beautiful, and a little more exotic and than the Earth. So how do you make it feel like Earth, but make it feel like maybe an ancient Earth, like a little more untouched by man, a little more previous to the Earth that we knew maybe many years ago, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away type of thing. And also an
or
Earth
maybe so far into the future.
That could be the other thing.
I love that too, yeah.
And just a world that's worth undertaking this quest for, a world that's beautiful enough, pastoral enough, picturesque enough, but that also we can relate to, that feels like our own, feels like the Earth on a really good day. That's what and to present that visually, which had never been done before outside of animation, which is a lot easier to do that in. So, because you could take a lot more liberties. So again, it's like, yeah, you almost get and me being such a big animation nerd, knowing the Rankin and Bass and Bakshi version so well too, and like, the fact that they incorporated some of that into this too, and I know Peter Jackson talks about the music in the Hobbit movies being taken from the Rankin and Bass and pulling from those other content almost in a nod-like way of saying like, these other versions exist. We were inspired by John Huston's voice or this song or the way the Shire hovels looked or whatever type of thing, and taking bits and pieces from the previous media and just peppering them in, which was really, really kind of neat too. With the characters too.
Well, let's explore some of the characters we haven't talked about if we want to talk about more before we get into kind of the last few questions I have. And Trent Miller gave us a really great way to talk about this. He says, "Hi guys.
Hi guys.
Who would you be if you were part of the Fellowship?" So this gives us a way to discuss some of the characters. I'm wondering, Dave, who are you most attracted to? And if there are other characters that are not of the Fellowship, whether 9 of them, then we can talk about them too. But I mean, who are you most attracted to as a character? I mean, who would you want to embody, or who do you kind of, who you have a little bit of a man crush on, or who do you, or like who do you? Because for me, I mean, I'll answer it. I mean, I love Strider a lot, and I know that that's also our sister Allie's answer. But I'm really quite attracted to Legolas, just because I feel like more like that's who I would want to be, right? Like, I think I'd be probably a little more effective in the back. I think maybe I'm a little smarter than I am brawny. I maybe can do a little bit of damage, but I have a little bit, I know my way around the world, and I have a really, again, ethereal, floaty, godlike way about the character, which I love.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering who is most attractive to you and why.
Strider's a great character because, he's the reluctant king. We know he's sort of destined for this regal stature, these regal standings, but he partially doesn't really want it. He's very heroic. He's got a very, he's like a lot of the characters, very stout-hearted. There's a selflessness to him, but he's destined for greater things. And I think part of his charm is that he's reluctant about that. He doesn't really want that, even though he's destined for it. Where a lot of people would be, you talk about man in these stories being power hungry, being corruptible, as a pair, compared to like the elves, which are like better versions of men, more sensitive to the earth, more, again, their physical beauty, their athleticism and all that kind of stuff, their agility and all that kind of stuff aside, being a physically more adept than men, but also just being more, I guess, just better people than man would be, but seeing the elves sort of put this man up on a pedestal, you realize Aragorn is special, that the elves even see something special in him. And the elves have seen the mistake of man practically ruin the world. I mean, think about Elrond and Isildur, right? Why this whole thing started, that the elves could take a man and put him up on a pedestal and give him props and say, like, no, this is the guy who's going to lead us into the new world and help us defeat this ancient evil and all that kind of stuff. That makes you realize, like, okay, no, this guy is something. There's even the elves see something in this guy, which I think makes Aragorn really cool. I'm really drawn to Gandalf because there's so much mystery in the character. Not only the fact that he's so warm and personable and likable and all of that, but at the same time, sort of be the keystone of this whole group that they rely on. When he's lost, when he falls in the mines to the Balrog, like, you think about it from their perspective and you see their grief and you're like, yeah, shit, they just lost their leader. Like, what are they going to do? Not only the experienced warriors like Aragorn and Boromir and Legolas and Gimli to some degree, but these rudderless, hobbits, like, what are they going to do? Like, they shouldn't
right,
even,
they're like so far from home and yeah.
They shouldn't even be here. What are they going to do without this guy's guidance? So Gandalf always really spoke to me, and I think just admiring that level of wisdom and worldliness, besides just being the courage, besides just instigating the responsibility of instigating this thing and putting the people that you love in harm's way. That's pretty fucked up thing to be charged with. It's like a military leader. It's like a general on a battlefield, right? It's like, yeah, these are the people that have dedicated themselves to you life and limb, and you're throwing them out there to be fucked by, the most overwhelming, daunting odds you could possibly imagine. Putting yourself in his place, really just having sympathy for that character and having to do that against what they would want to do in a perfect world. So Gandalf was always one for me. And I have a fascination with Merry and Pippin because they don't really need to be part of this thing, And again, it's just out of a pure love for Frodo, but also arguably just an ignorance of not knowing. You talk about the hobbits and being incorruptible and being pure of heart and, just being sort of in a bubble, living in a bubble. Like, they really just don't know any better. They don't know what they're up against in the larger world because they don't know that life. So there's a certain thing with them of like getting involved because they don't really know what they're in for yet. And that makes them kind of fascinating. And then see their evolution to go from like childlike to being thrust in this life or death situation, and sort of the tragedy with that of taking these young childlike creatures who probably would have grown to Bilbo's age being the same way. Like, let's get our pipe weed. Let's fucking eat cake all day. Like, let's just have a great time, to being like, to seeing death and destruction and evil and all these oppressive things. It's like, whoa, like these guys had to grow up fast. You know what I mean? So those are fascinating characters for me.
Sure. And I got to give a shout out too. It's a little bit trite, but just to Frodo himself, our protagonist, really, just the bravery, because to what you're saying, he says actually to Gandalf at some point, like, I've always dreamed of not being here. Now I want to be back home. And his whole conception of the world was through the writings, or I guess really not yet, but the stories of his uncle and his original adventures with the Horde. So to me, it's like, I enjoy really what all of the characters bring. Although I must say that with Gimli, I wish we got a little more Gimli in this. I feel like in the original book we did, because we get a little bit of the strife, the bad feelings between the elves and the dwarves, which is, again, one of those allegories we might have been talking, or maybe is an allegory we were talking about, but how he kind of comes around. You had brought up his kind of growing affinity for Legolas as they go on, but we don't really get to see why, except for that they experience some. It's probably like how you feel like when you're next to a man in a trench.
Yeah.
But, and then you both survive, and you both survive in part because of the choices you guys made together.
Right.
But I wish that we got a little bit more of that, because it's kind of tender. Like, he becomes tender too quickly without knowing why he's becoming that way. Like when he gets the elven woman's hair, and when he is like basically in love with her and all this kind of stuff, and he's finally cool with Legolas. It happens kind of suddenly, but I think that is the potential of the TV show with Amazon. If it's good, it will allow us to maybe spend a couple episodes even with Gimli and figure things out from his perspective. And like even seeing the mines of Moria when he finds all of his people dead. I mean, they're going to Moria expecting like a big reception, basically, and to find that it's been wiped out. Gimli has a lot of pain, right? Like we don't really get to see too much of that in the film. So it would have been kind of cool because he's the character. It would have been a nice juxtaposition because he's the character, the short, squat, bulky, armored, greedy, boisterous dude, but he's got feelings and he's got a heart, and things are kind of happening to him. And it would have been cool to see a little bit more of that in the film. No,
you're absolutely right, dude. You know what the thing is too? I think the book does explore not only the grudge, the ancient grudge between elves and dwarves. Like, you know, the elves think like the dwarves are fucked. Like all they care about is riches. They care about digging up their wealth. They don't, you know, they're not concerned. The elves kind of frown down upon them because they're not concerned with the problems of the world and stuff. And then the dwarves think the elves are uppity and all that kind of stuff. So you get a little more of that. But what's cool about Gimli in the books is that and you get a little of this in the movies, is that he's a little more elf-like in his personality. He's in touch with the beauty of the world a little bit more. He's a little more sensitive. He's a little more empathetic than like a prototypical dwarf would be, where it's just like, you know, let's drink and fight and dig up jewels and, you know, dig down in the earth and all that kind of stuff. It's more, he's got more elf-like qualities, and you could see them, you know, that's why Legolas is drawn to him a little bit, where he's like, oh, this is not your typical dwarf. And maybe it's because he's Glowing son, and Glowing was a little more worldly of an elf and had dealings with people, of a dwarf rather, and had dealings with people outside of the dwarf community, and being a traveler and going on this treasure quest with the hobbits and with Gandalf and stuff, and maybe a little bit was knocked down to Gimli. So it's a great point. You know what the other thing about Frodo is too? I have to nod to him, because you realize, especially in Rivendell, when they're putting the council together and he's like, I'll do it type of thing, and everybody's like, what? You know, everybody's arguing and stuff. His courage is the thing that everybody's drawn to, that they're able to put their differences aside and say, you know what, if this fucking guy could volunteer, then we could put our differences aside, our grudges, our personal desires about what we want to come out of this, and follow this guy. So through his courage, he becomes, you know, sort of the beacon and the leader that everybody, you know, again, this seemingly insignificant little creature of the Shire, like all these great characters, you know, storied characters sort of flock around him. And that's what made, you know, that, I mean, that's like a dream to be that person, you know, where it's like,
it's cool. Yeah. Know, they respect him.
Exactly.
And trust him. Because I think that the one thing the movie does, I think, really well in its limited time is that it shows everyone struggle with the ring but him. And so through that, you understand that. I really even love the scene when he reunites with Bilbo when he's with the elves in Rivendell, right? And he is taking his tunic off, and Bilbo sees the ring, and Frodo just buttons his tunic back up. And I was like, this is why they like him. He's the only one that can resist, and again, only uses it when necessary to save himself. And then again, the double-edged sword of that. The one thing I wanted to bring up too, before I get into some of my final questions for you, Dig, is what did you think about, because we were talking a little bit about the special effects and all of that, and I was talking about the tricks that they clearly used to, when they could circumvent height differences and all of that by using a lot of close-ups. But I wonder if there was any intent to hire like little people for these roles. I wonder if that was like something, because you think about the fuck's his name from Game of Thrones, the famous actor from that
plays Peter Dinklage.
Right, Peter Dinklage, right. And you look at him and you're like, he would be fucking dope in this,
Tyrion,
but they're almost too short.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, I'm almost wondering what their intent was with that, because that's like such a huge fundamental thing, the size differences between all the characters that are together. Just that in and of itself is like something I can't even begin to wrap my mind around.
It's crazy.
In terms of producing a movie, any movie. Like, how do we make it so that these people that are all similar in size, I mean, Sean Astin might be a little smaller, maybe they hired someone like Viggo Mortensen because he's a little bigger, or whatever the case might be, to dig those contrasts. But then you see shots like when all 9 of them are together, and I'm like, I don't know how the fuck this happened. And do you ever think about the challenge that must be inherent in creating something like that just based on size and having to constantly deal with it?
It's crazy. Yeah, because you basically have to plan your shots and storyboard around that, and to still be able to control the pacing and control the editing and not make jump cuts and all that kind of stuff. It's crazy. I mean, that must have been the biggest limitation or the biggest visual responsibility that they put a lot of labor into, for sure. I like the fact that because the Hobbits are really a different kind of creature, unlike anything else that we know of in fiction, they're not a dwarf, they're not a little person or a midget, they're certainly not an elf. To create this thing that looks a little different, that's a little different in scale, and not use... Now, I noticed that they did populate the Shire with little people. There were little people that played bit parts and stuff like that. But for the most part, to make the main characters, you know, the fact that they look like men, they look like little men. They don't look like a little person. They don't look like a dwarf.
Because that's the thing is, like, and I don't mean this as an insult, I think the audience knows that, but like when a person is a dwarf or like a little person, or a person like, for instance, has Down syndrome or something like that. Yeah. There's an aesthetic to them, even though they look like individuals, that you can kind of nail them to be like, well, this person has Down syndrome, or this person is a little person, or this person has this or that. Right. So I think that maybe that was what was important to hire, well, let's say full grown human. Yeah. And proportions too, because the Hobbits, you know, proportions is a big thing too. They don't have like shorter limbs and stuff like that. So to be able to make them look like really like a shrunken down man, you know, essentially something like we don't have in the actual world. You know, it's looks a little different in a real world. So with proper ratios, I think that's the important thing too, because a little person's ratio of their body is not right too. That's the right way to say it. Ratio is the right way to say it. Yeah. Yeah. Relative proportion. Right. One thing I wanted to ask you, and Bishop Hunter wrote in about this, is how do you feel about them filming it all at once? He says, "Sup guys, so as many of us know, they filmed the entire trilogy all in one go, which is why the sense of continuity between the films is so strong. Do you think trilogies should be done this way almost exclusively? It allows the films to come out at a faster clip and forces them to be at least somewhat cohesive. Imagine if the sequel trilogy had been done this way." So he's talking about episodes 7, 8, and 9. I generally think this is the way to go. Although I think the one Achilles heel to it is that you cannot respond to what didn't go right in the first film. So if Fellowship came out and something was fundamentally wrong with it, like, and I'm not talking about they filmed something wrong, I'm saying like the audience doesn't like something about this movie, like, you can't do anything about it. It's all in the can, and you're gonna have to go do expensive fucking pickups and get all the actors back, which is gonna cost enormous amounts of money. Might not be possible. As we said, even with Ian McKellen, his Magneto role in X-Men almost conflicted with this. So imagine going and being like, we need to film pickups now. So that's the one risk, I think. And that's why I think it's such a ballsy thing to do. And yet we can't deny that the continuity is there, because they literally film them back to back to back. Yeah. Which I love. And at the same time, it's funny to think about episodes 1, 2, and 3 in Star Wars being filmed that way in the 90s, and how it would have been the exact thing that we were fearing, which is like, if there was all like episode 1, it might have been bad. Although I think it gets worse. Most people think it gets better. So what do you think about the risk reward of doing something like that, about keeping everyone together, about filming for like a year? Yeah. But then letting everyone kind of go, and then you have this stuff in the can for years until it's ready to go. I think that that's the way to be, and certainly the cheaper way to do it, I'm sure, which was why they did it. Yeah, you're right about all those things. I mean, there's positives and negatives. I mean, with something like Lord of the Rings, the stories, the source material is already there. So you're not creating new stories like, say, the Star Wars sequel trilogy, where you're saddled with creating new things, and there's creative, there's new creative challenges in each one. I mean, there's a lot of creative challenges, but you have the core story that you're basing everything on that's already existed for decades. So you have that under your belt. So that's a positive.
I think they were beholden, especially when they were initially doing the films with Miramax. Miramax only wanted to, they were such a enormous undertaking financially that the movie studios didn't want to commit. So I think it was a cost saver and a time saver in terms of selling the project as a trilogy, where Miramax, for instance, or Warner Brothers, one of them was like, well, we'll do one of them, but you can't really just do one. You can't, you got to present this thing as a trilogy. That they tried that already. Ralph Bakshi tried that in the 70s, and Rankin and Bass famously did The Hobbit and then Return of the King, which was
that
really
doesn't make any sense.
Very strange. Right. So there was already a history of just fucking this up inherently, because I think it was challenging from a creative perspective, but also a financial perspective. It has a history of that. So I think it was a great way to sell it to movie studios. I think it was a huge undertaking for people involved behind the camera, in front of the camera, because I think it was a 2-year commitment, at least initially, what they planned for initially. So everybody would have to basically leave their families and their lives for 2 years to undertake this mission
in New Zealand.
The other side of the world. From
so you can't get home or anything like that.
It's really crazy.
I mean, you could, but you're not going to.
And I think some families came, but you're uprooting a family. You maybe have a wife, maybe you have kids, girlfriends, significant others, whatever. So that's a challenge. But it also deals with the problem that's hard to talk about. A lot of people don't talk about this, but when you have this huge media franchise that you're doing, this huge undertaking, and we saw it happen with the Star Wars sequel trilogy, where you have untimely deaths or people that drop out, for whatever reason, or have other creative endeavors that they're already sort of tied to. So this takes away all the problems of just doing it all at once, where you solve those real world potential issues. And, those issues at least become a non-factor. So you could see there's a little strategy inherent in that.
Definitely. What do you think about the other edge of it, though, about committing to something, that having the balls, right, to commit to something for 12 hours, basically, not knowing, like, you're committed and you have to see how people respond. I think it takes a lot of courage, but got to give it up to the people that funded this too, because that's a risky endeavor.
Yeah.
You could lose hundreds of millions of dollars.
Absolutely.
If the first one bombs, because you have these 2 other films no one gives a fuck about. I think I love the ballsiness of it, at the very least. Oh man,
there's a lot of conviction there. There's a lot of conviction, a lot of courage there. Talk about bravery, right? Yeah. And today it dawns on me too. It wasn't so much of a factor back then, but what if your Gandalf gets Me Too'd in the middle of the whole fucking thing?
Sure.
That whole thing. It's like, you could be really shooting yourself in the foot, especially in a 2020/2021 perspective. But, the other thing that's important to say, that it has happened. I mean, Game of Thrones had a couple different barracks. Mm-hmm. The Mountain was played by 3 or 4 different people. Now, they weren't main characters and it wasn't super noticeable, but it does happen. Especially when you have a cast as large as Game of Thrones, or, you have a relatively large cast in the Fellowship, the Return of the Lord of the Rings trilogy as well. So there's always a danger in that too, of like, not only losing somebody because they get sick or, God forbid, pass away, but, they get fed up. They get into a fight with they can't get along with the director. There's so many nuances in creating a film. I can only imagine how crazy it must get.
Yeah, I mean, think about even Dumbledore died when they were filming Harry Potter, right? And they had to replace him.
That's a great point.
And yeah, so that does happen. It is interesting. So, and like you said, the whole social cognizance of Me Too and all of those kinds of things, and how people can be taken down. I mean, look what happened to House of Cards. On Netflix over that. Yes. So, I mean, they couldn't do the last season of the show, like 5 years of buildup. And then like suddenly they just wrote a totally different ending. When I watched the first 10 minutes of it, I love Robin Wright, but I watched the first 10 minutes of it and I'm like, I'm not watching this. This is not, that show is so good. And this is not about you. So, these things happen and they can blow up. I mean, House of Cards was Netflix's very first huge hit. Yeah. So imagine losing... Imagine, and no one even talks about it anymore because of what happened. So it is interesting. But there's one other feature of this film that we haven't brought up yet that we have to, because a lot of people brought it up. and insisted that we talk about it, Dagan, and it's the music.
Oh,
Fat Houdini wrote into us and said, is there any soundtrack more iconic? Yes, there is, Fat Houdini. The track concerning hobbits just invokes such childlike joy and comfort. The March of the Ents is both intimidating and rallying. Is that even in this one? And the Caverns of Isengard is industrial to match the rate at which they're producing Uruk-hai on the edge of the forest. And so foreboding. Hands down, the score of the film is my favorite of all time. Howard Shore is a god among us. So I know that people were really amped because Howard Shore worked for a really long time and never won an Oscar until this movie. And I know that that was a huge deal, putting him on the map and finally giving, because there's certain people, I think wasn't it like Susan Sarandon or something that was nominated like 8 million times and never won. And you kind of get like stapled with that. Yeah. I think Leonardo DiCaprio or someone was another one of those guys, which is insane.
Scorsese didn't win for a long time.
Right. It's like, it's so insane. It's crazy. And then a movie like Precious wins. It's like, okay. So, although that's a good movie too.
That's a great movie.
What do you make of the music? I will say that there was one song, I should have looked up the name of it. There's one accompanying song that pops up every once in a while that sounds like a Final Fantasy music, specifically Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, that era. And I couldn't help but see the symbiotic nature between what we were talking about earlier, role-playing games feeding into fantasy, feeding into role-playing games feeding into fantasy. And I felt Howard Shore definitely doesn't play Final Fantasy, but that would be amazing. That would be awesome if he knew who Uebo, whatever the fuck that guy's name is that does the music for Final Fantasy. Yeah. But what do you make of the soundtrack?
I think we're embarking on that age too, where we're going to see famous film composers with that nerd-centric connection. I think that's inevitable. I think the last vestiges of those people are kind of washing their way out. I think if you're nerdy enough to be a film composer in the next 10 years, you're going to be playing Final Fantasy games. I just predict it's going to go in that direction. Maybe it's because as our generations get older now, the Gen Xers and millennials. But yeah, dude, the soundtrack is amazing. I mean, one of those things that's so easy to take advantage of because it's become and sort of just really not even pay attention to because it's so iconic now, and really great emotional touchstones, each piece of music to each part of the film, and the characters all have their themes, some which I think are really, really breathtaking and really emotional. You have Saruman's theme, you have Frodo's theme, you have the Shire music, you have Gandalf's music. Later on, there'll be another reprise of his music for when he becomes Gandalf the White. I love Gandalf's current theme. I think they play it when he is rescued from the tower from Orthanc. Initially, when the moth comes in and he says, get Gwarhir over here, whatever he's whispering to the moth, they play that music, which is a really emotional theme. And, it just ratchets up the emotion and the emotional power of what's going on in the film. And it makes you realize too, like, again, it's not just this goofy, if you look at it on its surface, it would almost be like a nursery rhyme or a fairy tale type thing, dragons and wizards and spell casting and these crazy places and dwarves with axes and all these crazy things. But it becomes so much more than that because of the performances, because of the emotion, because of the story and the relationships. And the music is a big part of that. A big part of the grounding element where it takes this seemingly campy genre, which a lot of people didn't really take seriously before this, with the exception, of course, the films that they're based on, and thrust it into a world that could be looked upon as any other great work of feature film, And by the way, Ian McKellen was robbed by Russell Crowe in 2001.
Oh, for Gladiator?
For Gladiator. Yeah. Before we forget to say.
I like Gladiator.
That's a great movie.
And Joaquin Phoenix is fucking dope in Gladiator.
He's so good in that.
In that white ivory armor at the end, I'm like, oh my God, it's so cool. But definitely not Ian McKellen level.
No.
But Dig, one other thing I want to ask you about, and you're much more of an expert in these books on a note or a line by line basis than I am. And this might even be something for Dad if we had him here that he could definitely speak on and elaborate on. But
he would love to do
I'm wondering what you think about what's missing from this book or from the movie, the movie. Alex Gritzmacher wrote into us about this. He says, I'm glad Tom Bombadil was omitted from the film. He serves no purpose for the plot whatsoever, and his entire existence in the book makes no sense. He is a bullshit character, and everybody who wishes he was in the movie is wrong. Have a lovely day. A lot of people wrote into this. Now, Tom Bombadil is maybe my favorite character from The Hobbit. I do agree that like the whole way he rhythmically in verse speaks and all, like, it's awesome. It's one of my most memorable. I have it in my mind when, see, that's a mind's eye thing where I have Frodo or Bilbo meeting Tom Bombadil in The Hobbit in my mind. I remember what I see that as, you know. Now he is in Fellowship and he doesn't appear here at all. Now this is probably the biggest contention, but I agree that that character, as interesting as he is, doesn't really serve a purpose in the book. So in this book, he serves a huge purpose in The Hobbit. And that was an echo to The Hobbit. I think that's the only reason he's in it. I wonder if Tolkien would have, if he can go back and if he was alive, if he would go back and rewrite it, if he would remove that. What do you think's missing? I mean, first of all, do you think Tom Bombadil being in the movie or not is a problem? And what else do you think is not belonging? Because as I recall, God, I got to go read the books and watch the movies again. But I feel like Two Towers was missing a massive part of it. And then they put that in the Fellowship, right? There was some weird, which is weird because Two Towers is the shortest and probably most linear book of the three.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of shit missing. But anyway, we'll focus with Fellowship. What's missing, if anything, for you? You know,
there's a lot of beats missing. Just breathing room. I think how fast it goes. There's one whole thing towards the beginning where Frodo, you know, once Frodo finds out he has to undertake this mission and the urgency is ramped up. And Gandalf's like, you know, you got to, you know, is it secret? Is it safe? That whole thing of like, it goes from like, all right, this ring might be a potential problem to like, we got to get this thing fucking out of here now. They kind of assemble, they go on a quest, and it takes them a while to get to the sort of the borders of the Shire, to Bree, to the Prancing Pony. And through that whole thing, you know, through their different dealings with with Farmer Maggot and with Butterbur, the innkeeper at there's this whole thing of like, who can you trust and who can you not trust?
Right, because they stay with a farmer first, right?
Yes.
And then,
yeah, which is like an ancient, which was like an old thing from when they were kids. They used to steal his crops and this whole thing. It's like who, as they're going from the very earliest outset, while they're still in the Shire, they have to find, you know, and Gandalf warns them, your name is out there. You know, the Sauron's emissaries are looking for you. And there's this whole thing of who can they trust and who shouldn't they trust. So there's that whole ratcheted up sort of danger from the beginning of like every time they come in dealing with somebody on the road or in Bree as they're staying at the Prancing Pony, even when they first meet Aragorn, which they touch on in this a little bit of not trusting him at first and stuff like that. When they meet Strider at the inn, there's this whole thing of from very early on of like this emotional thing of like who we have to keep this secret. We can't, you know, you can't call yourself Baggins, you're Mr. Underhill, this whole thing, which they really skim on in the movie. They get to Rivendell pretty quick in this. I think they're at Rivendell in the first hour or something where you have all this thing. And the important part of that arc too, their journey leaving the Shire, is also sort of the forming of us getting the relationships between the four hobbits. Eventually, you know, Sam and Frodo set out. Merry and Pippin join them later. They don't join them from the outset. So they're like, where the fuck are you guys going? You're not going anywhere without us. Like, you know, like that type of thing. So they're not leaving the Shire. They weren't leaving together. Merry and Pippin weren't a part of this. So that whole thing is missed a little bit. And then I would say the other thing with Tom Bombadil, I thought it was always confusing even in the novels, because I'm like, if this strange and mysterious power already exists here, what the hell is Gandalf doing? Like this kind of powerful, sort of eccentric, otherworldly entity is already here. Why isn't he helping? And, you know, what's the difference between him and Gandalf again? Like, I don't, you know, it was always confusing. And I think trying to make, although the character was really cool and it gives you something else to think about and it gives you a little more mystery, I think it would have confused audiences for sure.
Yeah, they definitely made a decision to remove him. And I think considering what you said about, it's very much hurry up and wait in this movie, which is interesting because in thinking about almost structuring it in an extended edition, 4 hours almost with credits, I feel like you could spend all of that time only in the Shire and not satisfy the story fully, which is, again, why it is so appealing from a length point of view to have them give it another go with the Amazon series. It's just, I don't know. It's just so iconic. It's going to be hard to outdo that. Now, Dakota Brown wrote into us and said, hey guys, I have a question. Have either of you tried showing this film to a friend or girlfriend only to be met with disdain or apathy? I recently showed it to my wife and she claimed to like it. However, she was on her phone or criticizing the editing most of the time, so I had a hard time believing her. Thanks for all that you do. So I'll say in my own world. So my girlfriend Micah she's a big fantasy fan, but she's younger. She's 10 years younger than me, and she's 27, and she came to games a little later. Like her big games were like on PS3 and Xbox 360. That's when she started playing games.
Okay.
So she's a huge nerd. She loves fantasy and all that, but she has less of an exposure to all of this stuff. So she had never read or seen Lord of the Rings. She's a huge Witcher fan and all of that. So she likes high fantasy, and she was enthralled by it. She loved it. And she was saying last night she was on her phone, she bought like the ultra blue HD Blu-rays and the books because she wants to read them and stuff like that. So she was really into it. Cool. And I was really pleased by that, because it's funny. Like, I hope she takes to some of the things I'm more I don't try to push anything on anyone. I'm pretty famous about not doing that. Like, I'll go listen to my political podcast upstairs, or I'll go watch like, The Expanse on my own or whatever. I try not to assume anyone cares about anything I watch or care about. So I hope she has this level of love for something I really adore, as opposed to something I like a lot, which is The Lord of the Rings. So have you ever had any experience trying to show this to anyone and failing or succeeding?
Well, I'm lucky, because Helene and I bonded over Tolkien. She's a big Tolkien fan. She loves The Hobbit. She loves the trilogy. We enjoyed the movies together before we were married. They came out before we got married. They started to come out before we were married. So she's a big Tolkien fan. She likes fantasy to begin with. Like, I talked about this on the podcast before, like Legend, Ridley Scott's Legend is like her favorite movie of all time. She knows it word for word. So she loves the whole sword and sorcery fantasy, especially the romance element. She's really enjoying Game of Thrones now. I finally got her to watch that.
She likes, what's that other show that everyone loves right now? That's like
she loves Outland.
Outland
is her big one. She, that was the promise. I had
the
the promise to start watching that.
If
she watched Game of Thrones, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, she won't admit Game of Thrones is better yet. And we're like I'm like, come on, please stop. There's no way out. I think I watched the first 2 episodes of Outland, and I was already like, oh Jesus, like, this is not.
Oh, Outlander is what it's called. Outlander.
Right, and there's also another one. I can't think of the other one.
I know what you're talking about. It's on Netflix, right? That people are really talking about right now. It's like almost supposed to be like a Downton Abbey type show, I think.
Yeah, it's a romance. There's futuristic. Is that Outlander, where they go back in time?
That's Outlander.
Okay.
There's another one that's kind of like a upstairs downstairs type thing that's really popular with women on Netflix right now. So it's popular with me too, because I love women's shows.
I think me too. Typically I do too. But that was the promise.
You gotta watch Downton. Have you watched Downton yet?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was Helene and I's thing.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, that was our thing.
Oh, we should do a show. No one will listen to that show, but we should do it.
What, Downton Abbey? I think you'll be surprised.
I fucking love Downton Abbey.
Oh, it's so good, dude. We should definitely do Downton. But yeah, for Helene,
episode by episode, I'll do that shit. You kidding me, man?
Oh,
it'll fucking take years.
Downton is so good. If you guys haven't
I'll do a whole episode on O'Brien alone.
The best. Come on, Thomas.
Yeah, he's awesome.
Best dude
Great
ever.
villain.
Best dude ever.
I love when he holds his hand up and gets shot in the hand during World War I, so he can go home. It's awesome. All right. Final question, since you brought up Game of Thrones, Dake.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I wanted to ask you, do you mind?
I'm sorry.
It's interesting in Micah, because we came through fantasy through other means, our respective generations. Whether it was video games, certainly JRPGs specifically, or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. She's coming through fantasy. We came through, I should say we came through it in the traditional D&D, Lord of the Rings, whatever. She's coming through fantasy through video games first.
Yep. Yeah.
Which is
like
really
The Witcher, I think, was a big... Yeah, I think Witcher 3 Wild Hunt was really seminal for her to get into, not only like really love video games as they are, role-playing games and all of that, but the high fantasy aspects of it.
Final Fantasy 2 or no?
No. She hasn't played very many old games. I'm trying to get her to go back and play more, but her time is limited as well. But I feel like it's funny to get her into this, and I hope I can just get her into other things that I care a little bit more about at some point. Although again, I'm not pushy about that stuff, so we'll see what happens.
I'm really curious to see, like, watching it last night, I'm like, I want to show this to my kids, and I don't know if they're going to like it or not. You have a lot of the trappings of just a great story, bravery, an undefeatable evil, friendship. You have all the fantasy trappings of princesses and, even the cool things like immortality and magic and all that kind of stuff. But I'm wondering if my kids are going to like it or not. I'm really curious for both of them. One's 14 and one's going to be 11. But I'm wondering, like, you know, do you think, I really don't know.
They're long, so that's what I think might be the biggest turnoff.
Yeah. Know? Yeah, that's a good point. I'll let
again,
you guys posted.
The Amazon show, again, might be the in for them.
That might be a good way in.
Unfortunately. Sure. But yeah. All right, let me ask this final question since you brought up Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah.
Matthew wrote in and said, "Hi, guys. I have a simple question. What do you think is the better world to live in? JRR Tolkien's Middle-earth or George R.R. Martin's Westeros? Thanks and fly, you fools." So I'm kind of curious, not only the better world to live in, I feel like maybe Middle-earth would probably be the better world to live in because you can kind of get away from the dastardliness of it all. It seems like, at least in the Shire and other places, Westeros seems to be totally engulfed by the winter at some point. But I'm kind of curious what you think the better story is and like what the better presentation is. I feel like Game of Thrones is better than this. Now I know that I didn't read the Game of Thrones books, Fire and Ice or whatever they're called. I tried to read the first one. I'm like, there's no way I'm reading this. It's just so dense. It's not the kind of reading I really want to do. I can't believe how dense those stories are. And you want to talk about things that are left out. Talk to people that read those books about Game of Thrones, you know, about how much is left out of the story. I can't even imagine because I don't even know what the hell's going on. And I didn't even know what was going on in Game of Thrones until I watched it twice. So I'm wondering, Dave, what do you think is the stronger property and which one do you think is the more compelling property? I really do think that Game of Thrones speaks to me more.
That's interesting to hear. That's really interesting to hear. I mean, it's really tough. I think they are different. I know how informed Game of Thrones was by Tolkien's works. So that's a thing to know going in. George Martin's very transparent about that. But they're so different. You know, Game of Thrones, if you really think about it, feels a lot bigger. And it feels like it deals with different things. Like you really see the politics in this world. You really see the infighting between these 7 kingdoms. You really see the conflict and the grudges. And then, of course, they show aspects of the world that, you know, Lord of the Rings is much more elegant. Like they don't refer to sex. You know, there's a romance and, you know, or romantic intrigue. But in Game of Thrones, it goes into those things much more graphically, obviously, with the sex and the violence and all that kind of stuff.
Too much.
It's much more fairy tale like in Lord of the Rings. You know, it's much, and it's a different world. It seems like, with the exception of Saruman and the Uruk-hai and everything, it's the entire world sort of going shoulder to shoulder against this against a common evil, which of course, Game of Thrones eventually, interestingly enough, eventually gets there, where the people have to sort of transcend their differences and fight this common foe by the end. But that's the way Lord of the Rings is from the beginning. So it's a very different story. It's one really seems very old school to me in the way it's presented, in a much more elegant and, you know, storied way, and the fact of being classic, maybe being a little more appropriate for children, feels more like a fairy tale. And of course, Game of Thrones is very HBO-esque.
Game of Thrones is not appropriate for kids.
You know, like there's no way. I feel like it's not appropriate for me sometimes. I'm like, what the fuck?
I actually, the second time I watched it, I would fast forward through a lot of the sex scenes where I was just like, I don't care.
It's useless. I hate it.
I don't care.
I really
it's just a waste of
like
time. It's just a waste of time. If I want to watch porn, I'll watch porn.
Yeah.
You know? Like, this is just a waste of time. You have an hour. Like, stop wasting time.
I get it with Littlefinger and the brothels and how the business and the life and Tyrion's sort of character arc from being this hedonistic dude to like being somebody of substance. I get all that. Like, but do you have to show it so graphic? Like it's, you know, like
it's a little much. I'm uncomfortable with that stuff.
It's not for me.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with that stuff in film. Even if I'm alone, you know, and I'm like, oh, this chick's tits are out. It's like, I don't, it's like, it's like that meme I love. You probably never seen it where it's like, you know, like do you know the Wojak cartoons? Like you've definitely seen them. They're like the meme cartoons of like the man crying, the girl, it's like all like these things people just switch in and out and make memes out of them. You'll definitely know them if you see them. But one of them is like, you know, so it's like a girl and it's like, subscribe to my OnlyFans, and it's like a guy and it says, I Google boob and get 2 billion returns or whatever, you know? And that's how I feel when I see sex scenes, because I feel like it's supposed to titillate, you know? And I'm like,
yes.
And like you said, Littlefinger and Tyrion, and there is sex plays a part. It's the same way I felt about the Tudors, though, where I'm like, show them getting together, pan up, show them getting together, go fade to black and go to the next scene. We get it. You know, like I get it. It's the same. I actually feel that way about war scenes too, where I'm like, all right, like,
well, let me
just tell me what
ask you,
happened
in Game of Thrones. Like, did you find it gratuitous in that show? Like, it was made to draw eyeballs.
Violence or sex?
Or both? Not so. The violence in Game of Thrones, I feel like they were just trying to. I just feel like they did it because they could do it. It was HBO, and
that's the way I feel about the sex.
I feel like there's a level of gratuitousness that's just like, it's not necessary. This is a great show with great characters, acting, story. Do you really need to draw eyeballs through this stuff?
Yeah, and I feel weird when that like they have the pasties on and like they're basically grinding on each other because it's so vivid and stuff. And I actually read a pretty interesting article, I think, in GQ about sex scenes and how much people hate doing them.
Yeah. That must be hard.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think I would go with Game of Thrones over Tolkien. Although I think Tolkien's, it's phenomenal stuff. It's foundational. It's essential. I mean, if you are a fantasy fan or a fan of fantasy-based fiction, like role-playing games and stuff, and you have not read Tolkien, you need to. Because that was the one thing that I think Micah was really smitten with as I was telling her. I'm like, this is where not only a lot of the things that we take for granted in tropes come from, but the nature in which they are. Like you said, it wasn't that he created the dwarf. It's that the dwarf in the image of Tolkien is the dwarf that we see today. It's the dwarf we see in Dragon Age. It's the dwarf we see everywhere, And so I think it's really cool that that both exist and both hopefully can thrive. I will say Lord of the Rings is more consistent just based on the fact that Game of Thrones isn't really done. So
that's true too. And Lord of the Rings ends well, and Game of Thrones is doesn't, at least what we know of Game of Thrones so far, does not end well, which is,
I wonder if they
does
will.
A lot. It's crazy to have high fantasy that was so inspired by Lord of the Rings, but also so different and, presented for a different audience, arguably, juggles a lot of characters. It's very big. It has a very big scope. It does a lot. It's not afraid of that. Game of Thrones is special. I mean, there's no question about that. It's unfortunate how it ended. I don't think I have I don't have as big of a problem with the way it ended. I still enjoyed it, but it could have ended 1,000 other ways better for sure. Like, I could argue that all day.
I'm confused why I don't mind the end per se either. I just don't understand why it happened so quick.
Seems
it's
rushed.
Like you lead up and you lead up and you lead up and you build and build and build, and then there are like 8 episodes that are just like I'm like, this is not acceptable.
No, it's so weird. So
very. I think a lot of it had to do. That's what I'm saying. Like HBO's insistence on staying with George Martin, even though he basically screwed the show.
Yeah.
By not finishing the story, even though they clearly was supposed to. I think he only got 1 book out the entire time that was even running. So they were supposed to, the idea was he was supposed to be done by the end, and I think he's 2 books away from being done. So
close.
The show's been over for a few years.
Unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
But he'll always get a pass for me because he is I've said this before, a huge Jets fan. So probably the most famous Jets fan in the world.
He's from Jersey.
Yeah, he goes to like preseason stuff and games, and he's always, how like the sports teams will show, like before the game they'll have like the famous people on the sidelines, roaming around talking, and he's always out there like dicking around.
That's awesome. Oh, so he's die hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, died in the
Pretty
cool
cool.
Jets fan. That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah. So we have that in common, I guess. But Dave, is there anything else you wanted to say before we go?
You know what? There's something that I realized this time in watching the film that I never realized before. And we know, like, the action scenes, you have those trademark, amazing set piece action scenes in this film. But I realized something that makes them extra special in probably all the Lord of the Rings movies, but certainly in Fellowship, is that you got 2 kinds of action in these action scenes. Now, they did a great job with scale and scope. You see Sauron in the beginning and how big he is and how he looms over that battlefield with his giant mace, and later with creatures like the Balrog, the tentacle monster outside the mines of Moria. Like, you get some amazing stuff with that. The cave troll swinging his chain around, how big he is compared to the other characters and how they have to deal with this huge thing. I love the immense scale and scope. This movie does that so well. But one cool thing with the fighting is that you get 2 types of fighting in each scene. You get the experienced warriors, the good guys like Boromir and Aragorn. You get these seasoned fighters, and you get the cool sword fights, and they're doing cool things with the daggers, and you get Legolas, who fights very cleverly, like an elf. Like he realizes not only is he super agile and stuff like that. And again, shout out to Orlando Bloom for a second. I don't think he does a bad job in this movie, but I think they make a lot of bad decisions, probably starting in Two Towers, where they start doing the action hero-y Silver Surfer, I'm gonna snowboard down the shield type shit.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which is just stupid. Yeah, make the elves super agile, make them be able to run on top of the snow. They're fleet of foot. They're more athletic than men, but like, let's show a little restraint. Like, he doesn't have to go snowboarding down shit and everything like that. That's not Orlando Bloom's fault. You know what I mean? I think he's not a great actor like a Viggo Mortensen, or certainly an Ian McKellen, but he does his best in the role. I think he certainly looks the part, but it's that actiony shit later on gets so stupid. But I love the fact that even in this, like he'll fire 2 arrows instead of 1, like those little inventive touches.
I love when he shoots when the orcs are coming through them and like one punches like just a hole in the door and then he just shoots one of them through it. Cool. Like it's awesome.
And he could shoot, he could shoot and reload from his quiver really fast. Like all right, that's elf-like. Like I get it. Like you're translating it to screen. It's awesome. And then so you get all the experienced warrior stuff, which is cool for the typical action fighting stuff, which is amazing, badass. But then you get the hobbits. It's like a street fight. They don't know what the fuck they're doing. So they're just improvising. Everything's on the fly. They're just trying to survive. So you get that whole thing where it's like they're figuring it out. And like they do such a great job at that, especially with the fight against the orcs and the cave troll in Moria, where, Sam's going between his legs. Like he's just trying to get the fuck out of there. You know what I mean? He's not trying to fight. He's trying to hide. Frodo's trying to hide behind the column, and the cave troll's trying to sniff him out. Like, it's so cool. And then Merry and Pippin
jump on their back and stab. Yeah, it's awesome.
Whatever they could do to survive.
Yeah.
And they make, it's like a street fight, and you make it. And then I'm figuring out, like, holy shit, that's what makes this so cool, is the tension involved with that. Like, these guys, there's very likely every time they enter into a battle, these hobbits are not going to make it out alive. Like, just to be thrust into that situation and the tension and the danger involved in that is so cool. And they do a really good job with that in these movies. They had to be thought through. They didn't just make it like, Sam pulls out his blade, it's glowing, and now he's fighting just like Aragorn. Like, it's very realistic in the fact, like, here's Aragorn and Sam fighting back to back, but Sam has no idea what he's doing. Nothing. It's like he can hold on to that sword.
Yeah, it's unbalanced and it's neat. It's neat. I do love the scenes where they're learning how to use their swords too, and like they have like scabbards, and it becomes a kind of a bromance scene where they're wrestling around, and but it's cool. It's very heartwarming. It's just one of the boys when you're in the Fellowship. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, dude. Well said.
Well, Dig, that was Fellowship of the Ring. So people can check out this first movie. Obviously, came out in 2001. I bought it on Amazon streaming. It was $14. I think it's $14 well spent personally. But you can get the hard copies of them as well. They might be streaming somewhere. I don't know. And of course the books, I was thinking about this recently. Those books are going to enter public domain in our lives.
Yeah.
Actually pretty soon, in the next 20 years or so.
Is that weird?
So to where they'll be free. So I wonder what they're going to do about that. I think that might be why they're also trying to extract as much money out of this as possible. Before that happens, because I think you have 80 or 85 years. So, but the book 1954, I think most would recommend you just start with The Hobbit, which is the original, and it's the prequel to everything. I really feel like it's weird to jump into the trilogy without that. That's why I feel like they should have done The Hobbit as well. But
yes,
they got The Hobbit done later, and then they spent all of this time on The Hobbit, even though The Hobbit's shorter than the Two Towers, nonetheless, the other two books. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, go check it out. There's a lot of options for you out there. And we appreciate you guys voting for this topic. Remember to support us on Patreon, patreon.com/laststandmedia for that, and to submit your questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, and ideas. But before we go, Dig, we have a tradition, which is a dad joke. So I leave it to you.
A tradition, my friend. All right. Now, shout out to listener and Instagram friend Brian Henninger. We've read his dad jokes before once or twice. Couldn't resist this one, so shout out to Brian and apologies to everybody else. Kyle, I started saying mucho to all my Spanish-speaking friends when I see them. They say it means a lot.
That's good. I like that one.
I couldn't resist that one.
That was a good one. I like that.
Nice job.
Very well done. All right, Dig. Well, thank you for joining me today. And thank you all out there again for your love, kindness, and support of our show and all things Last Stand Media. Couldn't do it without you. Merch, laststandmedia.shop, all made in the United States. Support us on Patreon again. Last Stand Media over there, patreon.com/Last Stand Media. Just nice reviews on iTunes if you listen to us over there. Give us a thumbs up on YouTube if you listen to us there. Those are all just extra views for us because this show has always been audio. So our show does the same exact traffic now on audio still that it's always done. It grows a little bit. But now we have these extra thousands of views on video. So we're getting a new audience. So we appreciate all of you guys out there discovering the show for the first time and sticking with us. Remember, you have a whole back catalog.
Oh, my God. Hundreds and hundreds of episodes.
No, not that many.
Not that many.
But over 150.
Yeah.
Over 150.
Oh, yes.
More than 150 is the technically, grammatically.
Okay. All right.
I hate when people get that shit wrong. Less than. I see it all the time. Like,
really?
Fewer
Why?
than and less than. I hate it. Like when people are like, I need less apples. It's like, you need fewer apples. You fuck.
Okay. I feel like I might be responsible for that.
I need less rain because it's who taught me this? Greg Miller.
Really?
You can count. Yeah, you can count. If you can count something reasonably, it's fewer. If it's something that is uncountable, it's less than. So think about, like you have a bushel of apples. You have 10 apples. I need 9 fewer apples in that bushel to get 1 apple. Okay. But if you have like, I don't know, like air.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, you don't say fewer than air. I need less air in this room. Right. That's how it works. I never knew that was
the rule.
Yeah.
So I need fewer rain. Got it.
Right. You need fewer rain. Definitely. You need fewer drops of rain.
Yes.
Because you can count the drops of rain. Less sand. Fewer grains of sand. Right.
Oh, there you go. Okay. All right. No, it makes sense. I think that just inherently makes sense, but that must not. Yeah, I could see people tripping up on that.
It drives me nuts. It's the same thing with, this is kind of dire, but when someone gets hanged, right?
Yeah.
People always say like, oh, he got hung. It's like, no, he got hanged. It's not hung. He got hanged. The past, it's hanged.
Hanged.
And you see people, even in books and stuff, where I'm like, it's not right.
Is hung a word? Like, if you looked up hung in Webster's, would there be? It's not.
What'd you say?
Hung is it a word? Like, no, the word hung is a word because it's the past tense.
The word hung is a word. Oh.
But you can't say it.
Right. Like you can say like, I'm well hung. But you can't say that man hung. That man hanged.
I gotcha. Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's the past tense of a verb.
Right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
All right, Dave. Well, let's end on that. Love you guys. We'll see you later. Goodbye. KnockBack, a retro and nostalgia podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is recorded from Central Virginia and the Philadelphia suburbs, USA. The show was conceived by and is produced by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-host is Dagan Moriarty. KnockBack's executive producer is Dustin Furman, and the show is edited by associate producer Ben Smith. Stand's theme music is by Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand Media's shows, including KnockBack, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer support level or higher on Patreon, and we're grateful for your kindness and generosity.